Good morning and welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee in 2021. We have received apologies this morning from Beatrice Wishart, MSP, and Dean Lockhart, MSP. Our first agenda item this morning is evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's culture sector. Can I welcome to the meeting our first panel this morning, Lucy Mason, Interim Chief Executive of the Federation of Scottish Theatre, Moira Jeffrey, the Director of Scottish Contemporary Arts Network, and Bill Armstrong, the Scotland Chair of the Writers Guild of Great Britain. Thank you all for coming to give evidence to us this morning. I'd like to start maybe with a general opening question for each of you. If I could just ask you in turn to describe the effect of the pandemic on your sector to date. Perhaps particularly taking into account the second wave over winter, because we took quite a lot of evidence from the sector maybe around about August last year. So maybe some kind of idea of whether things are better or worse for the sector since then, and perhaps a brief evaluation of the government help that's been made available. Who would like to go first? Lucy?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today. It's great to have the opportunity to reflect with the panel about how this has affected our sector. I think one of the fundamental changes has been the realisation that this is an ongoing crisis. I think there was an expectation back in May when presentations were given that things would move perhaps more quickly and that we'd be looking at a way out of this by now, and obviously we're very much in this, and I think we're in this for quite a long time to come. There was an amount of hope that did come when the levels were announced, and there was an opportunity for some venues in level 1 to open, but that was a very, very small number of venues within FST's membership, and actually there was no work to programme, because the opportunity to rehearse and for people to feel safely able to come together to do that was very, very small. So that window was very short-lived, and there was a cap on the amount of audiences that could come together. So 100 people was a very small number for if you were a large venue. So I think the realisation that this has an ongoing impact, and the bleakness that is starting to emerge, really, that sense of hope becoming a harder thing to anticipate. And obviously, the longer this has gone on, the less opportunity there have been for people to work. A lot of people have just not had the opportunity to work in the jobs for which they're trained. Theatres closed in March, and the majority have never reopened. And with that goes an extraordinarily large workforce of individuals who are freelance, who, whilst there have been some commissions for work online, that doesn't include a lot of people who work in very practical technical roles. So I think that lack of opportunity, which then creates an ongoing gap in our relationship with audiences and communities. A lot of our industry have very close relationships with their local communities across schools, working with vulnerable people, making very important links with their local environment, and all of those things have actually become incredibly hard to sustain. And I think the rising awareness of the lack of digital equality, so that while some people have engaged with work online, a lot of people haven't. And as we know, that can't replace the live experience. And as an industry that's predicated on bringing people together to share something together, actually we haven't been able to do that. So the kind of lifeblood, the kind of purpose of our industry has really started to completely be questioned, I think. And a lot of people have lost their jobs, and the prospect of coming back into employment within the sector is really hard to anticipate. So I think all of those things have accumulated. The level of support from Creative Scotland from the Scottish Government that's come through Creative Scotland has been greatly welcomed, and I think we absolutely recognise the amount of work that's gone into that by the team at Creative Scotland. You've worked extremely hard to get repeated tranches of emergency funding out of the door, but I think what's really starting to become apparent is perhaps understandably, but a real lack of strategy of what comes next. And even now, it's not clear what's really going to happen after the end of this financial year. So that's very, very soon. And for a lot of companies, and therefore a lot of individuals, and given that individuals make up all of the workforce, whether you work on your own or within an organisation, that lack of certainty is alarming. It's very alarming now. So I think it's hard to know what's better, but I would say that, a lot of things have accumulated that really start to feel like the next phase is critical, that we do have some kind of sense of a plan that both stabilises and invests in the future of the industry or the theatre and dance sector.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lucy. Just before I move on to the other speakers, I know that when we were taking evidence in August, a lot of the conversation was about how can we make theatre and performance and work in an era of social distancing? Can we make theatre safe? And what the subsidies going to be that will allow that to happen, because obviously it didn't wash his face. Do you think we've moved on from that now, in that, that's perhaps something that maybe was never practical, really? Well,
I mean, there's big challenges around social distancing, and I think it's really important to say that we completely respect that the caution around the public health agenda. We're absolutely an industry that is based on safe practice, so we would never want our audiences or our staff or our employees or our contractors to be in any way unsafe. But there is a practical reality about how you make work in a socially distanced way, how you create that energy on stage, and how you communicate that to an audience that is very socially distanced.
Yeah.
So there are creative challenges. I mean, we rise to a creative challenge. That's what we do. We've always done that. It's a very resilient sector, usually working with very limited resources. And people have found really creative ways to respond to that. But the audience impact, I think, is very different. If you are a very, very small number of people in an auditorium, it's a very different experience. And obviously, financially, it's almost impossible to make that work. So I don't think we've moved on from that being something that we don't need. We still need to look at that, because that is an ongoing concern, that we have to remain socially distant. But the solutions to that, I think, are still the same, that, it does need investment at one level. It probably needs, but I don't know how able we are to overcome the creative challenges around that.
Right.
And that's something we just need to keep practicing. If that's going to stay, then we'll be looking at other ways in which we can do that, so that we actually can create the best work that still actually communicates to an audience.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll now move to Moira Jeffrey, and welcome to your new position, Moira. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I think our position is similar to Lucy's in the overall context. So we have deep concerns about strategic context, the strategic context both for the recovery funding that's been received, but moving forward. What is it we're trying to achieve with that funding, and how best to do that? We have concerns about investment, and we have concerns about individual artists and freelancers, and we've provided some information that we've gleaned from a survey with our colleagues at Scottish Artists Union that reveals some real concerns about exit from our workforce. Our practical situation is different. Many of our venue-based organisations have been able to open when guidance has allowed, and those organisations that are not venue-based have been providing public value and services really throughout the pandemic. Many organisations simply haven't paused. So what we're looking at is a difficult January, strain those people who had been open when guidance allowed, obviously are not open at the moment. Our studio and workshop facilities continue to provide appropriate, safe workspace wherever possible, where guidance allows for artists and creatives, in order to make sure that they are able to earn a living. And that was very critical, for example, in the run-up to Christmas. So what we're seeing are issues around strain, stamina, real concerns about planning, timelines, and the wear and tear, I think, on a workforce that are doing their best both digitally and in person when guidance allows, to provide services to their communities across the country. The picture is widely variable. We have members from Dumfries and Galloway, for example, right up to Shetland. These are small charities with small workforces, and there's a real concern really about how to keep them going under the strain of these circumstances, and to maintain our workforce without significant exit and loss.
Thanks very much. Bill?
I think
you were just muted there, Bill, if you want to start again there. You're okay now, sorry. I think. Yeah.
Morning. Thanks very much for the chance to communicate to you. I think for writers, the crisis has exposed more than anything else the precariousness of their livelihoods that was pre-existing, and has obviously highlighted and extended that. For a lot of people who were hanging on by their fingernails, the new lockdown and the pushing back of the time when things might open up and get back to normal has pushed an awful lot of people to a point of really quite desperate uncertainty. Obviously, for anybody whose work involves live performance, the loss of income has been absolutely devastating. But it is a common misconception that film and television, because it is appearing on our screens, and that film and television is now taking place again, is that films are being produced. But the COVID restrictions are such that it slows down production to about a third of its normal speed, and that has an impact on commissions. So most of our film and television writers report a loss of half to 2/3 of their income, and that's from a very low base to begin with, because it's a very precarious livelihood. And on top of that, much of a writer's income depends on a future stream of income that will come from things that are in development now, will pay off in a few years' time. And because there's such uncertainty about what is going to happen in the future, financial planning for writers has now become all but impossible. There's another misconception that the crisis has allowed writers a lot of time to write, and it's just completely not the case, because for a variety of reasons, a lack of access to space where they can write, crowded accommodation, looking after children, parents, just the inability to turn the news off, the stress and anxiety that virtually every writer that we've spoken to has reported, the deep creativity, the creativity needed to initiate a project is all but impossible. One of the things that we're most worried about is that prior to the crisis, there was going back 30 years, there's been an increasing pressure on writers to do more and more of their work for free as margins get squeezed and production companies push down the pressure of their costs further and further down towards the bottom, which is the writers. And those pressures are increasing, and we can see that they are only going to increase more with the economic recovery as it comes. And that pressure on writers to do even more for free when they are at the point of collapse already is likely to increase. So all of this was bad before we went back into lockdown. It's as everybody has said, it's now got quite a lot worse. And going forward, I think the main thing that this has exposed certainly for film and television writers, but right across the cultural sector, is the need for a really quite severe rethink of strategic vision particularly for the film and television sector in Scotland.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned the pressure on writers to work for nothing. Where is that coming from? Do you have any examples that might illustrate that?
This goes back an awfully long way. It used to be that there's an initial stage of writing any project which happens before you get to actually writing a script. You start with a pitch, and then you go to a treatment. Sometimes treatments can go through multiple versions. That used to be paid. It used to be about 20 to 30% of your fee would be paid up front against your script fee. And then for the last 30 years, as small independent production companies got increasingly, when they become successful, they get bought out by big media conglomerates. And the vertical integration with the vertical integration, the profits migrate upwards and the pressure on costs migrates downwards, and it ends up on the writers. And so over a period of 30 years, the pay that has been devoted to that initial phase of development has got less and less and less and less, to the point, and it used to be you would get an option for your idea and you would be paid to develop it. And then there came in the idea of free options, where somebody would take an option on your idea and they would say, we will, if you do the treatment on this, we will then try to get it placed with a broadcaster, but they wouldn't pay anything. And then when they were not paying it, they would, the amount of time that you would spend on the treatment would expand, because obviously they wouldn't want to invest in it until they were absolutely sure that it was going to go. But that increasingly meant a writer doing weeks, months, and in some cases years of work for nothing. And if it didn't get taken up, there was no pay. And it's got to the point where that is so now normalized that a lot of production companies and producers don't actually realize that that is something that they should pay for. And also, as writers work from home, they don't work in the building. People don't see what we do. They don't see the pressures under what we're working. They don't see us work, and therefore they don't realize. I mean, the number of agents who have said just do one page, as if putting all the plots and twist turns and characters and the tone and the unique selling point of an 8-part series with a potential to return is as simple as typing up 500 random words, and it takes weeks, but nobody sees it, so they don't appreciate the work involved.
Okay,
so
that's very interesting and concerning. Thank you for explaining that to us. Okay, I'll now move on to questions from Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. It's good to see you all again. I did really first of all want to ask, I suppose, Lucy, about the support that there has been for the theatre sector. I suppose it's linked to a question about the way in which the government have approached the funding. If we go back to the summer when the consequentials came, which was the big sum of money, the 107 million, I think it was, there was spent, and the government seemed to have gone for a salami slicing approach. So there was some debate around should there be a more strategic vision, and what they have gone for is we're going to give this pot of money to theatre, this pot of money to the music sector, and that type of approach. Do you think that was the right way to go? And you mentioned the pressures we're facing towards the end of the financial year. What are the pressures? I understand all the pots of money come to an end in March, and maybe there was an expectation we'd be back to a more normal situation in March. That doesn't look like the case at all. So you mentioned the pressures that we're facing coming up to the end of the financial year. How significant are those?
Claire, could I just interrupt you a second? We're getting messages in that suggest that the broadcast has stopped, and I'm hoping to clarify that, because obviously if the broadcast is stopped, we're not on the record. So I'll just suspend briefly to clarify that. I'm being told on the chat function that we are still broadcasting, even though we got a message through the system to tell us that broadcasting has stopped. Sorry about that, Claire. I think you finished your question, so yeah, I'll let you continue.
So I think if Lucy heard the question, if Lucy would like to respond. Is Lucy still with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi. Did you hear? Did you hear the question? Was there a problem?
I got a little bit interrupted about the salami slicing. I wasn't quite sure. It got a bit funny there. So could you repeat the question around the initial tranche of government money?
So that's just the way in which the government decided to spend the money. There was debate around whether there should be a more strategic approach, and what they went for was a more salami sliced approach. So theatres got so much money, the music sector got a certain amount of money, there was individual pots set up for specific sectors. Do you think that was the right way to go? And the other question was about the financial pressures towards the end of the financial year.
I mean, I think all of this happened very quickly. I think it's understandable that the salami slicing, if you like, was an approach taken, that Creative Scotland has a very broad remit and it works extremely hard to kind of disperse its funding as equally as possible. And I think it was really right to be able to highlight certain areas where that investment was required. And obviously there was a pressure on that money had to be spent by the end of this financial year. So I think, I mean, I know that the theatres were very quick off the mark in making their case through the Federation of Scottish Theatre to the Scottish Government and Creative Scotland, and were one of the first to receive emergency funding, which was extremely welcomed. And that was a very efficient way, I suppose, of very quickly stemming an enormous financial gap that was opening up for venues who immediately, with their closure, lost their earned income and were paying back significant amounts of ticket income that they'd received in advance for shows that then were having to be pulled repeatedly. And that was an extremely valuable intervention. I think that then the wider COVA, the Cultural Organisations and Venues Fund that came in, which was across the arts, I think was a really important next step. I know that not everybody was able to benefit from that, but it was an opportunity for people to put in for money that would safeguard their staff as much as possible and create opportunities to commission work and to stabilise their operations. We all work on very, very minimal reserves, if any at all. You know, I think this is sort of a problem that goes back from just years of underinvestment, where people have been required to meet increasing costs on, at best, standstill funding, and that accrues over the years. And so I think it was absolutely true that those in a position where they were bringing reserves into this crisis were better off for a longer period of time than those who operate without any real sustained investment that secures their future. So you know, it was great for people to have that opportunity to bring in something to stem that gap, at the very least to stop all of that reserve bleeding out of the organisation. I think it was right for Creative Scotland to put money into youth and to music and to grassroots. You know, I don't know how else that could have happened, really. You know, it's impossible across all of our cultural sector to please everybody all of the time. And I think it's important that the message is there that we're all part of this together. And that's one of the things that I think we have to really navigate carefully through this time, that we don't want further disparities to emerge between us, really. We do all have to club together to make sure that the message that we bring value to the nation is a really important message that we don't want to divide, really. So I think we have to sort of look across the piece and see the impact of that £107 million. We don't yet know that, because actually it has provided, on the whole, stability in the short term. We don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. It could, but you know, I suspect that what's happened with that money is that it's put off what's going to come next. You know, it's been received extremely well in combination with the furlough scheme. As things start to shift, if that furlough scheme ends, we know that what's been enabled to keep going through that government money, through the Creative Scotland money, may well fall away. You know, the emergency is not over. The gaps are just being plugged in different ways. And there is quite a pressure on, if that money is to be spent this financial year, for a lot of people who received money back in May, June, you know, the Bridging Bursary Fund, for example, for individuals, absolutely critical for people who who'd seen as a freelancer their work just fall away. The opportunity to apply for some of that Bridging Bursary money was a godsend, but actually by now, what are we now, February nearly, you know, that's long gone. And whilst there's been an opportunity to go back into the Hardship Fund, little bits of money go very quickly, and particularly for individuals who were not able to access the self-employed scheme because they may have worked more in an employed context than a self-employed context, which is just the pattern of our industry. People go onto employment contracts for 6 to 7 weeks, then they're self-employed. that has definitely worked against people who have grafted away over years and years and were not able to then receive any money from the government. And I think that's, that's been greatly welcomed, but it's limited, and it has not reached a large proportion of people within the industry. So, I suppose the pots, your question about salami pots, absolutely, I think that probably was the only way to go, but each pot, if you like, was limited. In terms of the pressures for the 31st of March, at the moment, and again, I completely understand the position that Creative Scotland are in. They were, with absolutely the best will in the world, undergoing a funding review and looking at what was going to come by this time. In normal life, we would have been in a very different place than we are now. All of that work got totally thrown off course, by this pandemic a year ago. And so we don't yet know what that would have proposed. And we completely understand that the context in which that work is now happening has changed. But in the absence of a sense of what's next, it's very, very hard to plan. And also, without actual tangible support, it's very hard to make any commitments. It's for those organisations who are regularly funded, there has now been an agreement to pay a first quarter of that money again into next financial year. Which is great. My understanding is that a fourth year of RFO was proposed as an indicative commitment, but that it depends on that being agreed once the budget that I think arrives today gets processed, and there's a Creative Scotland board meeting to agree that the way in which that funding is going to then be allocated to the sector. So whilst the fourth year of RFO is welcomed, as I understand it, it cannot yet be confirmed. So there's an expectation that there's some security there for some of those organisations who are by no means all of our sector. It's important that those organisations are there, they're regularly funded, but there's many organisations that are not regularly funded. So for those organisations who don't have the carrot, if you like, of we're hoping that we can give you the same money that we gave you, an average of the same money we gave you over the last 3 years. There's a lot of organisations that don't know what it is that's going to come next. There's a lot of organisations who apply annually for funding for a programme of work. There's a lot of individuals who apply for projects. We don't know what the lottery funding is going to look like. I know it's held up better than we might have hoped. I think people in a crisis maybe play the lottery more, and that comes to us, which is great for the Open Fund, but we don't know if that's going to hold up. And actually, with the commitment to the RFOs that sits at Creative Scotland, there's not very much else. There's not much leverage. And I think it would be a real catastrophe if the money that's there within the Open Fund that is there to support individuals and those annually programmed festivals and venues, if that was decreased, I think we would then really be in a crisis. So I think there's just that lack of forward thinking, and I think where there's a bit of a mistrick, and I don't have the answers, but that opportunity to work together to try to find some solutions is critical, I think, because we can't expect Creative Scotland to know. Why would they? Nobody knows at the moment. But actually, we all are sensible people who could sort of work this through together. And I think there's scope for some kind of co-design of how this goes forward. My instinct is that we need a period of, I suppose, stability in which this creative and positive thinking can happen together. If Creative Scotland were to ask us next week to plan for the next 3 years, I think it's impossible for people to do that because it's unknown what that landscape is that you'd be programming into. And a lot of people have spent the last 9 months planning, replanning, unpicking, rebudgeting. I think people are absolutely exhausted by that. So the opportunity to have to keep revising plans seems a waste of our energy. For now, maybe it's better to agree and accept that we've got at least a year where things are just going to be in this transition, this kind of holding phase. And this is an opportunity for us to be well-resourced to find some solutions together that then enable, say, after 18 months to be looking towards the next 3 years of some kind of confident, renewed, well-resourced sector.
Okay, thank you. Can I maybe ask, convener, if there's time, can I ask Moira and Bill? There are two sectors. I've worked with SCAN and I've spoken to Bill during this whole process. And I think the situation was different from the theatres, and it might be that the theatres were a more immediate and a more visible sector in need of support. But did other sectors feel that they were listened to, that the support came in enough time? And how did you feel about the way in which there was pots of money created for specific sectors? Did that help your sector or not? Moira, would you like to comment first?
Yes, thank you for that question, Claire. I would have to say that, first of all, support works, which is why we want it. And we know how hard Scottish Government officials and our colleagues at Creative Scotland, as well as elected members, have worked on behalf of the cultural sector at this very difficult time. So that's really clear. And some channels of communication, for example, have become very effective during the pandemic. What I would say is that this has played out very differently across different sectors. So some bits of the cultural sector have had clear, dedicated funding. That's not the case for my sector. We have 92 organisational members, for example, who've all had opportunities or lack of opportunity in terms of accessing different kinds of support. There hasn't been a dedicated fund for visual arts organisations. And my real concern has been that by the time support reached my sector, which was in November, by the time that funds were announced and coming down the line, the scope of the discussion, the nature of the funding was really quite dramatically different from other kinds of funding. So we saw that within performing arts, at the early stage of the crisis, there was the possibility for support around a whole range of needs, including kind of adaptation, the opportunity to commission artists, etc. By the time funding trickled down to my sector, it was very limited around the scope of what you could do with the money and your eligibility for it. So, for example, the criteria were almost entirely focused around the risk of insolvency and of redundancy. Now, of course, these are really, really important. We really are fervently trying to avoid insolvency, but we don't want to mitigate against small charities that are prudent and trying their best to manage their budgets and reserves. So that was a real concern for us, because I think what we had hoped for was that sense of specificity of recognising our particular employment patterns, recognising, for example, that many of our organisations were open or providing services, at the same time as placing that within a clear strategic framework. So I suppose what I'm interested in is moving that conversation on to the future, which is saying that what we hope for is that level of responsiveness from government, that level of swiftness, where we're certainly with the bridging bursaries for individual artists, it was very quickly off the mark and very effective in dealing with what was a cataclysm of lack of work for individual artists and freelancers. But what we would hope for would be some level of specificity for our very different needs and different structures within an overall strategic framework. We want to look to recovery. Our organisations want to work with their communities as part of recovery. It's that strategic framework going on both at governmental level and in relation to Creative Scotland's future strategy that we'd like to be placed within. We feel that we can be at the heart of a wellbeing agenda. We know that the space that the visual arts sector creates, both in creating employment, in visitor and wellbeing economy, but also the space I think that we create for ideas, for innovation around the future, for the thinking that we're doing around equalities, around climate change. We really would like to understand that there is a strategic context for what we do. The COVRF fund was very, very welcome. Those amounts relative to the overall funding package are very small. Average awards in the kind of mid-50,000s, versus the scope of some of the performing arts funds. Now, this is not about sectors competing. It's about those who are dealing with recovery understanding the very different nature of help that's been available and the different nature of those sectors. So we share with our colleagues across the cultural sector real concerns about individual artists, real concerns about freelancers, a need for strategic context. But there also clearly are issues about how this funding was arriving. But again, to clarify, it's been incredibly welcome. It's taking our organisations forward, but we are hitting a new financial year. We're hitting a new set of concerns around future planning, about a lack of clarity about future strategic context. We're hitting uncertainty around budgets. We know that Creative Scotland has in fact, this Monday, issued a little bit of information about potential timelines for regular funding. But many organisations just don't know where they're going to be. And they have plans. Many of them have exhibition slates that are ready to go. We have workshops that are ready to serve their members and may need additional support to ensure, for example, that shared workshop facilities can be tooled for adaptation. But we've made many steps towards adaptation and need a little more to get it over the line. But specificity for our needs within an overall strategic context seems vital.
Thank you, Moira. And convener, is there time to invite Bill to respond to the general question?
There is.
Yeah. And Bill, if you would like to, yeah, I know we had discussions over the summer about the support for writers. Do you feel there was a need for more specific support, and did that come soon enough, or has the more general support for freelancers been sufficient?
All of our writers have suffered from the problems that Lucy highlighted. But in addition to that, there was a specific problem with screenwriters. With the creation of Screen Scotland, screenwriters were no longer eligible to apply to Creative Scotland's open funds. The equivalent funds that Screen Scotland runs, they made it, they were open to writers, but there was a heavy preference for writers who had a producer on board with their idea. So much so that in practice, it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for a screenwriter to get access funding from Screen Scotland without having a producer on board. Leaving aside the amount of time that the writer had to work to get the producer on board before they could access funding, it takes on average 2 months and sometimes quite a lot longer for a production company to read an idea. And during the first lockdown, most of the production executives who would have been doing that were on furlough. So that when the first lockdown hit, there was virtually nothing that screenwriters could apply for. Now, over the summer, Screen Scotland brought in a First Features Fund, which does allow writers to access it, theoretically without a producer. However, the guidelines of those funds do still make it give those who have a producer on board an advantage. It remains to be seen how many writers will be able to access that on their own. Screen Ireland, for example, has 2 funds that can only be accessed by writers. You cannot access it if you already have a producer on board. One is for new writers and one is for established writers. And those funds were topped up during COVID to support those writers who were struggling. There is nothing here for that. And had there been something like that, it would have made an enormous difference to screenwriters.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And convener, I had another question, but I'm happy to move on to other members, and if there's time at the end.
Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully there will be time at the end. We now actually have 3 apologies. We've also received apologies from Ross Greer. So if there's time at the end, as usual, I'll bring people in for supplementaries. Next questioner is Stuart Stevenson, MS.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I want to just start with a tech question to Bill Armstrong, just to clarify something you previously said and make sure I understand it. Bill, you said that production was down to 1/3 of its normal speed. Now, I just wanted to be clear what that actually meant. Was that just saying that the timetable is 3 times as long, or were you saying the effort is 3 times as great? Because clearly these are quite different things. And it's just a clarification I seek from you, Bill, if I may.
Hello, am I on? Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's both. It's both an increase in the time that it takes to film and an increase in the effort. I mean, if you think that filming tends to be done, it's a very much, at best, a seat of the pants affair. There's endless variables that are unexpected that come up. And if everybody has to stay 2 meters away, if everything has to be cleaned after every time somebody touches it, if everybody has to be masked and separate, it just it slows down the speed at which something can be filmed. And time is very much money in when it comes to filming, so that the longer it takes, the more it costs. And the longer it takes to film, the less you can do in a week, and the less scripts you will need. The show that I write for, they used to work. They would do about 22 minutes a day, which is incredibly fast for a film. Most film will work at about 7 to 8 minutes a day of finished film time. Now, as you slow that down, that increases your costs and increase the effort that you have to put in. There's a great danger of burnout of people, because things like if you're a lighting cameraman and you're working all day with a mask on and with very, very hot film lights, it takes a toll physically takes a toll on you, takes a toll on your mental capacity to be creative. And there's a whole host of things, not the least of which is, I mean, when you have actors who are doing a scene together and they cannot meet unmasked until the first time that they're doing that scene together, that creates problems of its own, would probably involve you doing more takes than you would normally do. The more takes you do, the more they expand the time. Sorry, that's very technical, and I hope it was clear.
Well, Bill, that was exactly the answer I wanted, to be blunt about it, because I'm quite happy to fess up to relative ignorance. Yes, I have been filmed for a film, but I don't recall very much about it anyway, and it's meaningless in today's context anyway. So I think that's a very vivid description of the difficulties that the sector that you personally are working in are experiencing. If I may turn to Lucy, and I may come back to you later, Bill, but if I can turn to Lucy, I'm inevitably, I want to kind of talk about money, but I want to talk about money in a slightly different way from where we have so far. And that is with the shift away from live performance with an audience in front of those who are on the stage or wherever. How do we see monetizing being online working? Is it working? Isn't it working? What role can government have in helping? Now, I put that in the context of that of course, we have public service broadcasters, for example. And I also look at Three's move from terrestrial and indeed satellite broadcasting to basically being an online channel. Which hasn't stopped its creativity, and indeed I believe it's won awards for Fleabag, which is drama that's just been on BBC Three. So how do we see monetising the very different world we're in and may remain in for some considerable time? How does that work, and what are the problems with that, Lucy?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think we have yet to discover how this is all going to work. I think it's fair to say this is new territory. A lot of people, a lot of theatre companies work very hard to put a lot of work online initially and made that available for free. I think there was no question but that was the way that the urgency, in the absence of being able to congregate with an audience in a live experience, the obstacles were already considerable to some people engaging with work online, and to create a further obstacle of financial requirement to do that. I think people absolutely understood that wasn't something they could propose. But as this has gone on, people are starting to look at income generation. It's very, very hard to know how to pitch that, and I would need to take more soundings from members and perhaps come back to you about different people's experiences of this, because it is fairly new for us. Charging has been introduced, I think, on a much smaller basis than it would be were that to people being asked to pay for tickets to come into a theatre. Some organisations have pitched it as a kind of pay what you can, so or making it a donation, or inviting people to contribute once they've seen something. I think people are experimenting with how it is to make that financial ask of an audience when you're already asking quite a lot of them to sit and watch something online in a very different context than they would otherwise be wanting to enjoy it. I think I would anticipate that the income that work online that's charged for will never make up for the income that could be generated by having a full programme. Nor can the experience ever be the same. And I think we do have to be careful. You're absolutely right. We're going to be in this territory for some time, but we also have to always keep in mind that what our sector is here to do is to create a live connection with an audience. And that is fantastically well enhanced by online work, but it cannot be seen as a viable permanent replacement. None of us want that. And in the meantime, it's about finding creative ways to use this platform, which is in itself quite limiting, but to use it as well as we can to help people understand that they can have some, other intervention in their life that takes them away from the horror that we're living through. In terms of how to monetize that effectively and what support is required, I couldn't put any particular sort of hard and fast figures on that, but I think if it does remain something that we all have to embrace, we do need to look at actually what the gap is between the cost of that and what might be generated, and there will be a gap. So I think it's a work in progress, really, Stuart, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific about it. I think that I think it's also important to say that there are relatively few organisations who have been able to afford to do this. A lot of people have put a lot of stuff up that's from their sitting room or their study. It's a smaller number of people who've been able to actually get into a studio or a theatre to actually present work in a more staged, collective way. I mean, as Bill said, that's always been having to be done in a socially distanced way. And as Bill said, that takes time. So the costs are different, and we haven't all kind of worked out the best way to do that yet, I think. So I think that investment is definitely required. The level of it, I would be hard pushed to say exactly at the moment.
Right, that's very useful. I will just make the sort of partisan comment that as someone who lives in a rural location where it's a 3-hour round trip to contemplate visiting a professional theatrical event, having more options online is not necessarily a bad thing, but that really doesn't help the sector very much, the comparatively small number of people like myself. But I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to move to Moira and perhaps just really pitch the same question to Moira and see, and subject to what the convener allows, we won't be finished with this, I think, just in this immediately. Moira.
Yes, I suppose first of all, you need to understand that the ethos of the visual arts sector is free at the point of access. So our funding model is complicated. It does depend on earned income. Earned income might be, for example, if you were venue-based, it might be based around a capybara for venue rental. Earned income might, in other sectors, bits of the sector might be around, for example, if you're an artist studio or workshop facility, you may earn money from fabrication and certain kinds of workshop fees. But in terms of audience provision, we're free, and that is our fundamental ethos, and we continue to work on that basis digitally. So what we've seen, for example, is film festivals like the Alchemy Film Festival in Hawick. They went online, I think, within days of lockdown. From their homes. They ran an entire film festival. That was very successful in terms of audience reach. What it didn't provide was that energy and income generation in the town itself, which had always been vital, that at that moment in the year, Hawick really benefited from the visitors to the festival, from the footfall. So I think it's really understanding that the income generation model is complex, that we can pivot to digital, that our organisations are saying to us they would like some investment to enable them to think that through. Where digital has been really effective is that we have a range of members who work with very vulnerable people. So they provide one-to-one often or small group support, for example, with people with health issues, mental health issues, disability, the older population, or segments of the population that might be isolated. And those organisations, which include, for example, a case study we've submitted from Dundee Contemporary Arts, a small organisation like our organisation Garda and Shetland, they continue to provide that kind of community support via digital. What people need, I think, is a little bit of time and financial support, a rescue package that actually allows them to develop that offer. But they've certainly moved it, but digital for the visual arts sector is not about bringing money in. It's about the offering of services, the sharing of artists' voices, and the sharing of artistic programming. I think people imagine that digital will continue and that hybrid models will continue, but we are in a different situation, I think, from some of our fellow members of the cultural sector.
Thank you, Moira. And I want to just go back to Bill to develop the monetising issue with him, and in particular, perhaps, to ask the question for people who are involved in writing, whether the current copyright laws are sufficient to protect the assets that come from the writer's pen or finger these days, and just more generally, how difficult and what options are there, and if anyone's got any ideas of how government can take away barriers or create frameworks that might help all this. Bill.
Just before, so just to echo something that you said a moment ago, one of the few silver linings to this crisis has been that writers have not had to spend hours and hours on a train going down to London for meetings, often unreimbursed, and it would be hoped that is kept up. No guarantees. In terms of copyright, there are ongoing problems with copyright, particularly to do with the streaming services. The whole question of copyright is becoming extremely grey. It is something that our union works constantly on because it's constantly changing. And with the huge streaming organizations, we are in conversation with Netflix, which is hugely important. But it is a massive problem for writers because that is our income stream, is what keeps us alive. Mostly what we earn is not sufficient. In order to have a decent living, you need that income stream. Which is part of the problem that we have with free options, is that because it gets so loose and your rights get so watered down, that very important principle that of ownership, of intellectual property ownership, is becoming a problem. I do know, I think I'm right in this, that there was a European copyright directive that the UK government didn't sign up to, which was mystifying because it would have benefited pretty much everybody in the UK. The people it didn't benefit or wouldn't benefit would be the GAFAs. And as I understand it, I may be wrong about this, but as I understand it, the UK didn't sign up to it primarily because it had the word European in it, which is an enormous shame and has done enormous damage to all UK writers. So right. If you could get in touch with your colleagues in Westminster and get them to see some sense on that, that would be very helpful.
Well, I'm sure we'd all be prepared to contribute to that, but I wouldn't hold your breath for success. Convener, I'm going to hand back to you and think about my further questions, because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff come out of that, and others may also want to follow up. Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson next.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel there. There's a couple of issues I wanted to touch on. I was interested just now on Maura Jeffrey's comments around the digital, but if I can firstly look an area that's or an area of interest, particularly to me. I'm a Highlands and Islands MSP, and obviously cover huge remote, well, largely remote and rural region with island communities, and etc. So I was just wondering if I could ask Lucy Mason whether there have been particular issues facing some of their members in terms of in rural areas, or say island communities, how there's been particular impact or difficulties. And one of the issues that has come up in the wider tourism sector is the tier system, and where perhaps because an area may be in tier 3, so actually legally able to open, the business just isn't there because tourists particularly aren't there, and obviously in some cases tourists may be quite important. So if I could ask you those couple of questions, that would be very helpful.
Jamie, I'm sorry, I missed the second part of the question. Actually, it was a little bit blurry.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. The second part of the question was where there is the tiering system in place, and an area has been in, say, tier 3. Therefore, a lot of places are not required to close by law, but essentially they're not able to open because the business isn't there. And therefore, in some cases, the support hasn't been there, whether that's been a particular issue at all.
I think thank you. It's a really important question. I mean, actually, there's a small number of our venues, our members rather, are based in the Highlands region and the islands, and actually they were amongst the small number of organisations that were able to open in that autumn period. There was a range of different responses to that. I think members that were on the islands who felt that actually on Skye, for example, they didn't really want to bring people in. You know, there was a real anxiety around that public health agenda of actually at that point feeling relatively virus-free, and the prospect of people coming into the theatre and the prospect of people travelling was not one that was welcome. So there was a sort of fear in a way that because it was permissible to open it, that actually we needed to reinforce for people that they didn't have to. You know, so I think we're in this very constant, this need for a constant kind of balance between what's possible and what's desirable, you know, what's in the public interest. And I think we've been really reassured by the responsibility which our members are taking to safeguard the health of everybody that's involved in the process of making and presenting theatre. I think in the conversations I've had with venues who are in those Highland areas, in the Highland area, that actually the sense of community and the place of their venue or their activity in the community is really, really strong. And so whilst people have not been able to operate as a theatre, they've functioned in different ways in serving their community in different ways, and have that very personal contact with people who would previously have come as audience members, and actually that social interaction and providing means of offsetting loneliness and retaining service of some sort, be that in terms of food delivery or being a host for certain other community activity, has been really important. So I think what we've seen is the kind of flexibility of our members in terms of being able to respond to the position that they found themselves in. I totally take the point that Stuart made before about audiences being able to actually overcome the remote geographic the distance from where theatre may otherwise have been happening, and to be able to have found work coming into their own homes in a way that they maybe otherwise wouldn't have done has been a real benefit. And I think we've all appreciated that actually it has, for those who do have access online, that actually does bring us all a bit closer together, but also being acutely aware of where that isn't in place, that distance is reinforced, and that's not something that it's really important that we find ways to overcome that. I think there are a lot of individual artists and individual members of FST and across the sector who actually, for reasons of trying to save money, previously have moved out of the Central Belt and moved into more geographically remote areas in order to limit their costs, who now find themselves even more isolated, because actually where work has been able to happen, it will have required travelling, and a lot of people won't have wanted to do that, or it hasn't been allowable within the levels system. So I think there are some pros and cons, people living in the Highland area, and it hasn't been a straightforward one size fits all impact as ever. Our members are extremely varied in the different ways in which they contribute to the theatre and dance sector, and everybody's experienced this pandemic very, very differently. So yeah, that's my response to that. But I think that where there's, for example, when there were the possibility of test events, we talked about that happening in Inverness, because level 1, the venues could open, and that opportunity to sort of prove how safe it could be, that we could present work to an audience in a socially distanced way, and that our workers could be safe. But we were never really able to get that off the ground, because actually it was really hard you can't just press a button and theatre is sort of on stage, it takes time to happen. But I think there's a lot of, on the assumption that we maybe come back to those more underpopulated areas becoming the starting point of theatre reopening, I think there's real opportunity there for that to become the place where those opportunities get explored for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully you can hear me a bit better. I've just moved a bit closer, which is a technical solution to not being able to be heard. But I mean, local theatres particularly are always important parts of communities, especially in areas, like where I'm from, Orkney, and a number of people I know are very much involved. They're vital, they're loved, they're really kind of treasured, but they're not always. They often require a lot of support to keep going. So given we've had this almost a year of shutdown on the whole from the kind of the day job that they do in terms of providing shows and other events, and it will be some time before we open up again. And then of course there's the confidence issue, to some extent for some people, which I know will be a big issue. We've touched obviously about the support, but do you feel that the support is there? It's clear enough how to access it, and it's sustained enough so that we theatres can come back after the pandemic, because it's not just a question of shutting the doors and closing up for a short period. There's still the bills that have to be paid. There's still the heat that has to happen, otherwise, all the kind of reasons like that. So is there more that can be done by both governments, I suppose, and also local government too, to support them at the moment, and what will be needed over the next period?
Yes, I mean, I think for a lot of small venues in rural areas, the economics are very, very, very fragile. If you can only seat 50 people, so there's a baseline requirement. So there's something about acknowledging that success does not equate to quantity, that actually it's the value of the experience. And as you say, a lot of that is about connecting into the community, not necessarily in the venue, but in that outreach work. Often that will be on an individual basis or perhaps in small groups, and it's often with people who, as Moira said, that there are vulnerable people. There's ways in which we connect to bring our work to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to come into a venue, say, however small that is. So subsidy, by its very nature, is there to plug the gap. It's to cover the difference between what something might generate in income and what it actually costs. And for a lot of the smaller venues in the rural areas, then in the Highland area, there are actually a lot of promoters who work on a voluntary basis, whether that's out of desire or need, and it's sustainable up to a point, but we need to make sure that those people who are in positions where they're taking responsibility for programming and the safe delivery of work, that are properly remunerated for their work. I think a lot of support is piecemeal, and the opportunity for us to take this opportunity to acknowledge that programming a work, building an audience, sustaining an audience, be that online or in person, takes time. And it is by far the best way to do that is with knowing that you have a secure period of programming that is properly resourced, that you're not doing it project to project. And I think that is often the problem for a lot of the smaller venues, that they don't have that longer term security of funding. So that they can't make commitments to artists, they can't make commitments to audiences. Everything happens very late, and without the real opportunity for long-term planning, to plan with artists, to invite people to come and make work locally. Those things all take time, and that needs long-term commitment of funds. So that would be what I feel we need to work towards, is more sustained funding that's more geographically and more widely made available on an accessible basis to more people.
Thank you. Just one more question to you, and then I'll maybe pass it to Maura as well. But the issue around the digital and the role of digital, gone are the days that there was a kind of shaky camcorder at the back on some of these performances, and that might be provided that those were particular fans. There is more work being done online and recording done online in some cases, but also, as was pointed out, just kind of communications and promotions. How important is it, particularly in some of our more remote and island communities, that we get the broadband, we get the digital infrastructure in place to allow some of that work to be done and to be promoted better than perhaps it is at the moment? And do you think digital for your members will be increasingly important going forward?
Before you answer, can I just make an appeal for concise questions and answers, please? Because we've got another 2 members who have to ask questions after this. So, and if members could maybe direct their questions to particular members of the panel. Thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt.
Right, thank you. I think the question was directed at myself. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I was actually asking Lucy, and I was going to come to you, Maura, as well. But I mean,
sorry.
Just perhaps a very quick answer from Lucy, if that's okay.
I didn't entirely hear all your questions, Jamie, but I mean, yes, broadband needs to be accessible. We all need to benefit from that. That equality needs to be in place. So I would absolutely have that as a given. I think there's also a thing about investing in the equipment that enables proper filming to happen, so that the quality of the work that is streamed or is made available is of the highest possible quality, so we're not undermining our own work as we go. I think what we've learned through this is that digital is not an add-on. It is an integral part of the way we make and communicate work, but we need to be running it in parallel with live performance. As I said before, it can't replace it. In the short term, it's a fantastic alternative, but it's not something that everybody is able to make. They don't have all their equipment to do that. The quality won't be as good. And what we don't want that to do is put people off, and so it's kind of a constant balance that if all the work our members want to do is of the very best quality, and in some cases that work is compromised at the moment because not everybody is able to broadcast in the highest possible quality from their bedrooms.
That's super. Thanks, Lucy. And Maura, thank you. If I could have your thoughts on that as well. Sorry, you're just muted at the moment.
Right, I'm afraid that's not in my control. I think we should be able to hear it now. Is that all right? I'm completely hands-free in this situation, at the mercy of the broadcast team. Yes, so digital here to stay, but we are trying to learn very much. SCAN is very engaged with those of our members who live in rural communities. We're trying to learn from other institutions, for example, at UHI, who have expertise. But I would say that digital is not a substitute for art making. Take Orkney, for example, a collection like the Pier, both its permanent collection and its temporary exhibition programme, where people are making real work in three-dimension, not real work, that's the wrong word, but work that presents itself in the analogue world. That certainly continues to be the core of what many artists wish to do and what many audiences wish to see, and in terms of audiences also and participants making. So digital is not a substitute, it's something else.
Maura, thank you very much. Apparently my technology is breaking up, so at the heart of Edinburgh and government, we apparently can't get good broadband either. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And now bring in Christine Graham.
We can blame the government for his breakup of his sound, but that said, I'm just thinking to things, a comment that was made about making this all more available on an accessible basis. You talked about digital, but I'm going to talk about terrestrial. You get things like Portrait Artist of the Year, Landscape Artist of the Year, the Great Pottery Throwdown. Whatever you think of the artistic merit of these, they have a popular following, as indeed has Netflix. So I've got two questions. As we try to think of a different world, as we come out of this pandemic and maybe go back into them occasionally, who knows? Is there not an opportunity for the media, the TV channels, the film industry, to commission our writers and film producers and other artists for work to appear on terrestrial means? I mean, I'm thinking back to the 30-minute dramas where Dennis Potter cut his teeth. They allowed writers cut their teeth. So that's one question. And you get a bigger public reach. And it's obviously we have rescue packages now, but we want to go into investment into the arts and engage with people. And my second question is about, have there been any discussions with Education Scotland about bringing the arts and theatre into the schools? As many moons ago, a secondary teacher, I could think of ways where this could link into the syllabus. I know that the syllabus is crowded, even from primary right through to secondary. I'd like to see the arts more in the schools, and that lets children cut their teeth on getting engaged with the arts as they get older. And they see a theatrical performance perhaps in their school. And then they get the idea of what live theatre's like. So there's my two questions about commissioning work for terrestrial programmes and Education Scotland. And that's really just a wide question to anyone who wants to sort of answer it. Oh, and is there a role for government in liaising in this? That would be my sort of bit. Is there a role for government in assisting? Mr. Armstrong.
Yes, yes, there is. Short answer to that. I think what we need for the economic recovery, from our point of view, more than anything else, what Scotland desperately needs, is a long-term strategic vision for a Scottish film and television industry.
Yes.
One of the things that we've been doing is we've been in discussions with the Danish Film Institute and the Norwegian Film Institute. The Danes took 25 years, but they have built a television industry now where they cannot produce enough television to meet world demand. Their television reflects Danish stories from Danish writers, and they've done that by supporting their writers. We have submitted some proposals to Screen Scotland for funds that are just for writers, because there are various ways you can build a film and television industry, and at the moment our concentration is on attracting big things like Game of Thrones, Outlander, offshore production that comes here in films that can bring a lot of employment, but it's extremely vulnerable to things like exchange rate fluctuations and to fluctuations in film fashions. And the other thing that we are doing is investing in small artisanal films that hopefully will win some kudos at international film festivals and highlight Scottish talent. But those things on their own will not build a sustainable film and television industry. To do that, you need multi-episodic television series with a potential to return. Things like Dairy Girls, which has done wonders for Northern Ireland. We need something like that here. In order to do that, you have to invest in the content and the people that produce the content. There's no other way of doing it. And yes, there are ways that the government could support that. I think we need to look at how to build the infrastructure and how to build a real national broadcaster. And apropos your second question, I think one of the proposals that we came up with earlier in the year was a national arts force of paid creatives, including writers, to work in community schools and care homes. And I think beyond what you had suggested, just to give you an example of the spin-off effects of it, I mentor a young person in one of our local high schools, and I was paired with this individual because he wants to be a writer. So I go in and I give him the benefit of my experience. But beyond helping him and exposing him to the arts, there are the people on this mentoring program are emotionally vulnerable, suffer from a lot of vulnerabilities, and in some cases quite considerable mental health issues. And over the course of the pandemic, when those mental health issues have been exacerbated, it has been a critical lifeline for this mentee, that the connection that he has with me. Now, if you multiply that by what a national arts force could do, then it is beyond. I mean, the spin-offs are enormous for that, and I would suggest that a national arts force would be something that would be worth the government considering.
Is there some kind of document that says a briefing on this national arts force?
I think it was included. It was mentioned in Putting Artists in the Picture. I can forward you some things yes, I will. I'll get your email and forward it to you.
Because I have to say, Mr. Armstrong, I was an English teacher of long time ago. We've done other things since, but to liven up, even to bring just plays that kids are doing at school, or even books and so on, performers coming into schools, make a huge difference. A huge difference. And I'm disappointed this doesn't happen more. I know logistically it's quite tough, but it would give work. And what's your comment about, please, what used to be that 30-minute drama thing, that could be commissioned now by the BBC, commissioning short plays for new writers. And from them, as I say, the Dennis Potter came out of that. Wonderful writers came out of that. Is that not something that could be happening now?
Yes, I think it could be happening now. We have just recently had discussions with BBC Writers Room Scotland about a programme that they're running, which is, I don't know any other way to say it, but it is fairly shambolic. It suffers from unclear objectives, conflicting objectives. I think that there is a great deal that the BBC could do, and I don't. It suffers from a lack of holistic thinking and from a lack of vision. Apropos Scotland, it's a very, very large problem and beyond the scope of this short session.
No, but you've made your point. Does anyone else want to comment? I mean, that's writers and performing arts. What about visual arts? How can we? I mean, I know whether you think of Portrait of the Artist of the Year or Landscape Artist, at least people watch it, and it gets them engaged in the process of paint on paper or drawing and sketching and so on. So can you see anything there that can be developed and within schools?
I'm not sure if I'm muted at the moment. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Yes, so our sector engages really thoroughly with schools. We have a national organisation, Engage Scotland, that deals with this matter. We're concerned about where visual arts sits within the national curriculum and within the expressive arts context. It is one of our manifesto asks in this period. We've shared this document with MSPs where we're calling for a greater role for the visual arts within schools, and certainly in terms of the level of engagement in the nation with visual arts, the imbalance between that level of engagement and the opportunity for that voice in the media is really notable. As a former journalist, that's a real concern of mine that if you compare, for example, sports coverage with cultural coverage, but then we look at the number of people who engage with the cultural sector, how many museum visitors we have versus football gates, for example, we do feel that there is a huge amount of scope for that national interest conversation to take place as widely as possible in both print and broadcast media.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has any other comment, but that's fine. That was my 2 questions. I see somebody wants a supplementary on National Arts Force, so I'll back off now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Christine Graham. And now we move to questions from Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning, panel. I'd just like to follow on from Mr. Armstrong. I'd really take on board his comments about Denmark. Actually, last night I watched an excellent film on Film 4, The Guilty, and this week I've been watching the investigation, and I can thoroughly recommend DNA as well. So Danish TV cinema has really dramatically improved in recent years. But I noticed that in its talk on the Danish model, and that it says it costs as much to train Danish screenwriters, directors and producers as it does to train Denmark's airline pilots. Well, I checked the figures and it's £86,000 to train an airline pilot. So, you know, given the figures that have been bandied about in the report, I mean, how realistic is it that we'll have enough money to train enough screenwriters to make a significant difference in terms of having a Scottish model which is equivalent to the Danish one?
I think the more important lesson to be learned from Denmark is not, I mean, their funding is far in excess of ours as well, and it would be wonderful if we could afford that. But the more important thing is that we develop a holistic view of how to train. At the moment, screenwriters are almost entirely taught how to write by script editors and producers. There are almost no courses where writers teach people how to write, which has always struck me as like getting a plumber to teach somebody how to do carpentry. And there is no kind of overall vision of how we integrate writers into, or anybody, writers or producers into the system. It's a very, very British kind of ad hoc, sink or swim approach. We need to go right back to all of the film schools and work out what needs to be taught, how it needs to be taught, and how to feed those writers. And they have a system in Denmark when at the end of your training as a filmmaker, any kind of filmmaker, in your graduation year, there is an event where the people from the Danish Film Institute, they get together with all the production companies in the country and the graduates, and they meet up, and everybody is introduced one another so that the writers, the directors, the producers then get to know the people that they will be dealing with over years after that. The producers get to know the new people coming through. And one of the significant effects that has is it stops the brain drain of Danish producers, directors, and writers from flowing to London and Berlin and Los Angeles. And brain drain is an enormous problem that we have in Scotland. They're short of, I mean, it would be wonderful if we could afford the kind of money that they have, but I think it's more a question of their attitude of the value of writers and the importance of their content, and therefore paying attention to that, which is something that doesn't exist in Scotland at the moment, and I think we suffer for it.
Yeah, and who should provide the leadership for that? You talked about film schools, or should it be Creative Scotland, Scottish ministers? How do you think, where should the leadership be provided? Because we can all agree this, but there has to be someone who actually drives it forward.
I think there should be consultation between Screen Scotland, between the government, between the film schools, and between the union would be a good place to start. We are at the moment, we are doing a program with Scottish Union Learning where we are taking a program to writers, because one of the problem with writers is when they get into the business, because they've never been taught by writers, they have no idea what to expect and what they're coming into, and it means a lot of them fall at the first hurdle. Christine mentioned, she talked about the BBC. One of the problems with the BBC Writers from Scotland is that there isn't this holistic approach. People are brought into a program, they're thrown into the deep end, and when they fail, they're chucked out. And there isn't a long-term, this is a long-term support, and we need all shareholders in the industry to get together and work out how to plan this better, rather than just leaving it to this ad hoc, sink or swim approach.
Okay, thank you. And Moira Jeffrey, I'm just looking at your own submission here and talk about medium to long-term funding, and you suggest that 1% of the Scottish Government's total budget should be devoted to cultural spend. One of the issues we had as a committee was trying to identify just how much money was actually being spent on cultural and supporting Scottish culture, because obviously there are a number of funds. For example, local government contribute significantly more than we had thought as a panel before we started looking at this. So how can we ensure that we have a situation whereby, should the Scottish Government find the resources that you require, that we don't have a situation whereby local government effectively rolls back and as if to say, well, being funded by Edinburgh, so we'll just no bother?
Well, I'm going to defer to the expertise of the committee, who spent a huge amount of time on the funding inquiry, and we support that broad aim that you've suggested. It does seem to be what seems to us a sensible figure. One of the things about the pandemic, obviously, is across the board it has exposed fragility in many sectors, and it's revealed what we know to be a fragile and precarious situation for continuing arts funding. Local authorities are essential to this picture in terms of the provision, not only for their own services. So I think it's not just the ALIO's, cultural trusts and local authorities' own cultural provision, but it's the support and strategic context that they need to provide for the cultural sector in their places, so in their cities, the broad support and cultural framework. And I think one of the essential things for us at this stage is understanding an aim like this 1% in a big strategic context. One of the things that we're really keen on at the moment is that local authorities, along with their economic and social recovery programmes, their aims for renewal in those areas, must also aim for cultural recovery. So I think there has to be a really helpful, open and robust conversation with local authorities, who themselves are really suffering in terms of loss of income. We have members who are sitting within trusts and ALIOs that ultimately sit within local authorities or beside local authorities. So we need to have a really, really strong conversation in strategic context there. And we need local authorities to understand the potential of their role, the potential of culture in their local renewal and recovery programmes.
Okay, thank you. And in section 3 of your submission, you give us a lot of really interesting and important figures. For example, you talk about the negative impact on life and career, and you've got, most negative effect of their income, worse for 72% of people, new opportunities, worse for 71%, etc. You talk about 28% of people falling through the cracks, uneven impact, reduced opportunities for self-employed workers, with 92% in self-employed roles being worse off. But what are the kind of numbers we're talking about? I mean, is this committee is also responsible for tourism, and we get very detailed figures of what the impact is. So how many people are actually being affected? You've got all these percentages here, but I'm quite keen to know how many people have lost their jobs, how many people have had diminished incomes, etc. So we can get a better grasp of the kind of real difficulties that your sector is facing relative to others.
To this particular survey, to give you some kind of framework, the papers that SCAN submitted to the Scottish Government in the summer, we were looking at that time 330 employed people's jobs at risk, but 3,500 freelance workers whose jobs were potentially at risk. So the scale of this, one of the things the reasons that we're asking for specific responses and dedicated funding for the visual arts is that we're terming this hidden and invisible redundancies in our sector. We can't give you an organisational picture which says we have X number of employees and this is the total redundancy number, because so many of our workers are freelance. Now, we commissioned this research with the Scottish Artists Union, and when they go on to give evidence in the next stage of the inquiry this morning, they'll be able to help you in much more detail with this and talk through the findings. But we're really concerned about the picture for freelance workers, and it's not always about top line numbers, it's about proportion of the sector. So when I talk about some of these smaller numbers, we were looking at potential of jobs at risk being over 50% of employment in our organisations. And what we need people to understand is that this is about infrastructure and about jobs that won't come back. And it's about impact. If we lose an organisation, say, I don't know, in Lochal, sure, if we lose an organisation in rural Dumfriesshire, the risk of that not coming back is the real risk, and it's the weakness of infrastructure and impact on overall workforce. So it's less about hard numbers. These metrics don't explain, and this is one of the issues about recovery funding to date, simple metrics about numbers of redundancies, for example, don't work for us. It's impact from freelance workforce, it's proportion of overall workforce, and it's a network of really rather small charitable organisations and freelance workers that form our sector.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, as John Gordon Sinclair said in Gregory's Gill, boys think in numbers, and I'm one of those. I think it's good to get not only the kind of share of a sector, but also the overall size of the sector, because that scale gives us information on what you are actually facing and how the committee can try and assist you. Because this committee is obviously extremely sympathetic and supportive. We don't have a budget of our own, but we do try on behalf of the sector to lobby ministers, etc. So moving on to Lucy Mason, because obviously we've got another panel and other members who want to speak. Lucy, what the report you gave us, for example, you mentioned your COVID recovery report, which provided a detailed case for an overall 12 million in recovery needs to prevent job losses. But we've moved on a lot since then. We're clearly deep into phase 2. We don't know when that's going to end. So where are we now in terms of what can we do for the sector in terms of not just emergency resources, but putting in the kind of long-term plan that you're really looking for to take the theatre sector forward?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, and I echo what Moira said. I think there's something about the hidden numbers of people leaving. So I think that from the freelance task force work that was undertaken earlier in the year, last year, was identified that about 70% of our workforce are individuals, they're freelancers. And a survey was done at that time which indicated that maybe 1 in 3 people are likely to leave the sector because they can't afford to stay and they haven't had the opportunity to work. So that's a hard thing to quantify, and we will seek to try to identify where that's sitting at the moment. But that's a significant drain of skills, and it does mean that as and when we're in a position to reopen and present work for people to make work safely and present it to an audience of whatever scale or in whatever location, there will be a real danger that the expertise is not there. And we need a variety of different skills, people with a variety of different skills to make our work happen. And I think we have to be really, really mindful that in order to sustain those people who are not in a position to work, that does require subsidy. So I think in terms of what's going forward, there's a raft of different levels of funding that is for individuals in a really sustained way that's not about hardship. I think we have to try and lose the rhetoric around that. I think people are in a lot of hardship. There's a lot of stress on people's well-being and mental health, but largely that's because they cannot do the work for which they've been trained, put in a lot of years to qualify in order to be able to work on our stages, to create work, to write, to design, to perform. So there's something about securing the validity of those professions at a time when it's not possible to really practice them. And I know that's a leap of faith, but actually that's what we're here for. We need people to trust that actually everybody wants to do this work and to do it well. And in the time that's not really possible, or it's possible in a really diminished way, that support, that resource needs to be secured in order that when we can come back, we do have a capacity there that actually makes that possible. Because undoubtedly there will be pressures on when, let's hope that there's an opportunity for theatres to open, for festivals to happen. There'll then be an expectation that there is work to be seen. And at the moment, it's hard to know how we'll achieve that. So there's something about a level of support for individuals, a level of support for organisations who hold a workforce which is depleted. People have made redundancies because they're not able to justify the cost of staff not able to do their job. You know, it's like the economics have just not worked. Furlough has been an amazingly important part of that equation, but if you're a charity and you're a governance, you know, your board is looking at the going concern prospects of an organisation, your outgoings and your income are very, very different at the moment. So unfortunately, people have had to lay off staff. And I think that does deplete the means that those organisations have to restart confidently. So if we can find a way to secure for the next 12 to 18 months, organisations of whatever size who need to be in place for us, our sector to stand a chance of coming back and contributing to the wellbeing recovery and the economic recovery and the creative recovery of the nation, that isn't just going to happen. It does need to be sustained. So I think there's a period of sustained funding, and then there's a period of development funding. There's a period of funding that comes beyond that enables us then to adapt to the environment in which we find ourselves, in which our artists and our producers are going to have to work together to bring work to an audience. And I don't know what that is yet, but we do have a lot of creative minds, and those people need to be paid to be able to work together to think through what those solutions are.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to ask one more question. I can't convene. I know Bill Armstrong was to come in, but just again to Lucy Mason. I can really sense your deep frustration. You're also, because of social distance, probably not going to be able to sell as many tickets. I mean, I've got a couple of tickets for the Book of Mormon that were from June last year and they've been put back to June this year. But one wonders in sellout shows whether or not it'll even be possible. Also, we've got touring companies. Will they be able to have all the performers still able to participate that would have been able to participate before? And that brings me on to, you know, two aspects of theatres. One is obviously the static theatre and all the kind of people that actually work in that theatre itself and the support, you know. But what about touring companies? How are they being affected? How's that being impacted? Because, you know, how should the Scottish Government support artists that might be based elsewhere in the UK but will perform here in Scotland, for example? I mean, obviously, the Edinburgh Festival gets considerable support, but I'm thinking specifically about theatres.
I think it's a really important question, and thank you for bringing it up. I mean, the majority of the companies and the producers and the artists who making work in Scotland are touring that work. They're taking their work on the road to audiences and meeting audiences across the country. They're taking a lot of their work out of Scotland, and all of that international work, which previously was held up as a real kind of beacon of success. It was a way of presenting our culture overseas, was really it was valued and it was rewarded, and that has obviously, for all sorts of reasons, that's just gone. And whilst there's an enormous amount of opportunity that comes with online, international connection online, that the impact of losing that work has drastically reduced the income of those touring companies. The benefits are environmental, and I think that has been a really important acknowledgement that actually we need to look at different ways in which we can have that make that connection with overseas audiences and present the value and the quality of our work as theatre and dance companies without necessarily having to get on an airplane and travel around the world. But we haven't yet worked out what the alternatives are. How do we sustain our work? You know, you get better, the work that our artists put on, the more they do it, the better it gets. You know, the company comes together, that touring, that long-term presentation of work is really critical to the success of the industry. At the moment, that touring, it can't happen, and the unpredictability of whether venues are open, whether venues are closed, is very different across all four nations of the UK. So England previously were able to open venues. They didn't have 2 metre distancing. They had, I think, 1 metre plus. People were interpreting that in different ways. If you were a producer based in London who would previously have been presenting your work on the big stages in Scotland, in Aberdeen and Inverness, in Edinburgh and Glasgow, why would you take the risk to do that when actually the venues were closed? They might open, but you could only seat 100 people. So there's something about needing to provide insurance, some kind of mitigating the risk that actually it's our audiences that lose out. if that work can't be brought here. And of course, it's the creatives, it's the individuals who make up the workforce of those touring shows who also lose out. So there's something about being able to get government-backed insurance that I think is really important to enable people to take risks to make work and to present work in Scotland. And we need to find alternative ways of giving that kudos to those companies whose work was lauded overseas, who have lost income and profile as a result of not being able to do that now.
Yes, I saw La Boheme last September outdoors in Glasgow. There were less than 100 of us. It was absolutely Baltic, despite having umpteen layers of clothing. So, companies, Scottish Opera obviously have tried to adapt, but it's extremely difficult in our climate. Thank you very much. I think Bill had a supplementary that he was wanting to respond to.
We're going to have to wrap up so that we can get to our next panel. So, Bill, your contribution's been fantastic so far, but if you could wrap up as concisely as possible, thanks.
Just very quickly, in response to something that Kenneth and Moira said, is that one of the things I think that we found over this crisis is just how poorly the creative freelance sector is understood. And one of the things that came up in a meeting that the creative industries unions had with the government recently was the idea of an open source national database of workers, creative freelance workers in the cultural sector, in the creative industries, and what they do, how much they earn, which would be invaluable in terms of understanding what exactly this sector consists of and being able to quantify it, and also in terms of enabling this hugely underutilized resource to benefit the country in terms of knowledge transfers between different parts of the cultural sectors and also the rest of society, and also informing the construction and use of this national arts force. And it's something that could be government-led in conjunction with all the unions and organizations.
Thank you very much, and that's actually a great segue into our next session, which is with the workers' representatives for the industry. So thank you very much to our panel, Ms Mason, Ms Jeffrey and Mr Armstrong for attending and their evidence today. We will hear from our further panel of witnesses in a couple of minutes, and I'll suspend for a few moments to allow that panel of witnesses to. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone, to the meeting. We continue with agenda item 1 with further evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural sector in Scotland. And can I welcome to this meeting Linda Graham, President of the Scottish Artists Union, Paul McManus, the Negotiations Officer for BEC2, and Barry Dalman, the Acting Regional Organiser in Scotland and Northern Ireland with the Musicians Union. I don't know if you caught the tail end of our last panel where we were talking about the impact on creative freelancers in the culture sector, where Bill Armstrong was talking about a meeting between the government and trade unions and workers' representatives from the sector about finding a way forward. I don't know if you were able to talk to shed any light in that, if you were involved in those discussions, but perhaps maybe go into detail about just how freelancers have been affected and whether the funding streams that have come forward to support the sector, in your view, have done enough to support individual artists and creative freelancers in the sector. I don't know who wants to go first. Linda. Linda, yeah.
Hello, panel. Thank you, convener. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, I think, yes, in common with the other speakers that we heard from this morning, there's been obviously COVID has exposed the already existing precarity of self-employed artists working in our sector. Our members have had a catastrophic loss of income, and as self-employed workers, they have multiple income streams, which have all been affected. Some headline sort of figures from the recent survey that we've done, and 92% of those that were self-employed have told us that it's had an impact on their working conditions. 54% had less hours, 51% have had contracts cancelled, 47% postponed. And worryingly, even with the government support and the sector-specific support that's been allocated, 73% of our members are now relying on savings or family and friends. So that is a very worrying figure. And also, we found that 10% have moved on to universal credit, so they are claiming benefits directly as a result of COVID, and 5% have left the sector. We're also concerned about the impact on equalities, because a large number of our members have said they've been unable to carry on their practice due to caring responsibilities, or they've been impacted because of their disability. So there's been, obviously a very huge impact and ongoing impact on our members carry on their work, and opportunities to exhibit has been affected as well, with galleries closed and studios shut, and shared spaces like printmaking studios and places like that shut. So we would like to see longer term planning and artists and the unions integrated into those discussions going forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And we can perhaps go back to that later as to how they should be integrated and what those plans should look like. Paul, do you want to come in next?
Thanks, convener. Yes, I do. When you're talking about creative freelancers, from our perspective, that the makeup of creative freelancers varies widely across the different sectors of the industry. In live events, film and TV, the vast majority of our members are indeed freelance. In the theatre and arts sector, the vast majority of them are regularly employed zero hours contract staff. Some of them may consider themselves as freelance, but the vast majority of them technically are zero hours contract staff, proportion are permanently employed staff. So I think it's important that when we're looking across the sector, we understand that the majority of people we're talking about are people who are employed on a zero hour contract basis. In terms of the creative freelancers, as the same as submission, there's been widely disparate approaches here. Creative Scotland and Screen Scotland have been very proactive in using the additional funds they've had to support the freelancers. There is still a percentage of the freelancers who have missed out in any form of UK government support because of various technicalities around the rules. In the live events sector, it's been a hugely different story where probably the vast majority of freelancers have had no additional support from the Scottish Government because of the way in which Event Scotland applied the funds. So I think one of the points we have made is that from the Scottish Government's point of view, there needs to be a clearer steer on the various agencies about more consistency and you know, the criteria that they should or shouldn't be applying in order to provide support to people. And going forward, that support will need to continue. You know, the comments from the earlier session, comments from MSPs, you understand that this is going to be the last industry to open up again. And I think in terms of supporting the freelancers, you know, it's interesting to know that Ernst & Young produced a European-wide report yesterday which said that with the exception of aviation, the cultural industries have been the hardest hit industries across Europe, and that for up to the next 10 years, governments will need to allocate 2% of their total spend in order to support that recovery. And that, you know, that 2% spend, there would need to be careful discussions with the local authorities because there will be a trade-off with the funding situation that local authorities are in. Then we will find that local authority budgets will be cut for the arts as we move forward again. So that there needs to be ring-fenced or protected funding. You know, there needs to be a strategic approach from the government to say this is the amount of money we want to go in to support the industries and the freelancers in the industry and people working in the industry. But that needs to be done hand in hand to make sure that we're not, you know, giving money in one hand and taking it away with the other.
I noticed that in your submission, you make a number of references to theatres in particular who receive funding from the Scottish Government, who nevertheless went on to make people redundant. I mean, my understanding was that the government was very clear that they expected money going to organisations to support jobs.
That was certainly our understanding of what the money was to be used for as well. You know, and I heard the Federation of Scottish Theatres talking about some of the redundancies. We saw the accounts of a number of theatres that were very quick to move to redundancies, and what was driving them to the point of insolvency was the cost of the redundancies, not the cost of maintaining the staff. A number of those venues would not have been insolvent at the end of this financial year, given that Creative Scotland moved very quickly to reassure them that you know, their funding was secure for the year. If they had not instigated redundancies, they would have made it to the end of the year, albeit not in a very healthy state. But it was the cost of the redundancies that was driving them to the point of insolvency. And I have to say that in some of those cases, Creative Scotland was less than supportive in driving forward the agenda that the money was to be used. You know, right. and we're talking big numbers here. You know, that Loughrea immediately moved to instigate over 50 redundancies, barely before the government had made a mention of any additional funding. You know, Horsecross, over 100 people made redundant or laid off. The Lyceum wanted to get rid of 3/4 of its workforce. The minute the UK government started talking about ending the furlough scheme and introducing costs to the employers, the Lyceum moved to lay off 3/4 of its permanent workforce and all of its 0 hours contracts people, was probably totaled in the order of about 100 staff. So there was the commitment was there from the Scottish Government. The commitment was not enforced in some of these employers.
Right. And in terms of Event Scotland, what was wrong with the structure of their funding offer that was detrimental to your members?
Well, essentially, the position with Creative Scotland and Screen Scotland with additional funds, the position they took was if you can demonstrate that you're a professional person working in this industry, you qualify for support. Event Scotland, for reasons best known to themselves, said, well, first of all, we need to identify what the industry is. So they split the industry effectively in two and said, right, well, if you work for the big music promoters, the big concert halls, you know, the big event promoters, then we will consider you as working in this industry. And if you spend more than 40% of your time working for these types of organisations, then you will be eligible for funding. However, they said that, you know, if you're a lighting designer that happens to spend 41% of your time delivering lighting designs for discotheques, for weddings, for small-scale events, then we don't consider that to be the professional industry, and therefore you do not qualify for support. Now, those members say, I work in live events. I spend my whole year earning my living in live events. Why is it relevant that, you know, I spend X number of days a year working for the SEC or the Edinburgh Conference Centre and X number of years, you know, designing lighting systems for discotheques?
Yeah. Do you think that that had a particular impact on people working outside the big cities? Because certainly representing the rural area myself, I have come across people in the sector that happened to.
Very much so, very much so. The more you move away from the big centres, the more people's the type of work they do varies. You'll get people who would say that they spend most of the time working in live events, you know, small scale music trends, doing local festivals, but they'll go into, you know, trade shows, exhibitions, they'll do a bit of theatre work, they'll do a bit of film and TV work out of necessity, you know, because there isn't that scale of work all year round in the rural economies, and they were penalised for that.
Thanks very much. That's concerning. And I know that other members will bring in Barry. I'm going to move on because I've taken up quite a lot of your time already, and I'm anxious to make sure that all members get their questions in. So I'll move to Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to return briefly to the previous panel mentioned the National Arts Force, and that came from the Benny Higgins report that was published in the summer, that was the economic response to COVID, and his proposal was a National Arts Force. My understanding is the Scottish Government responded and established a National Partnership for Culture that was set up in June. I wonder if you've had any engagement with the National Partnership for Culture and what your understanding of the purpose of the organisation is. The previous panel, we had I suppose a fleeting discussion about restructuring or prioritisation for funding within the sector as with a more strategic approach. Do you understand that's what the National Partnership for Culture are doing, or do you have any engagement with them? Who would like to go first? Linda, you had talked about the need for artists to be integrated within decision making. So do you have an awareness of where do you know of the National Partnership, or where else do you find that your voices are being listened to?
Yes, we did seek to have an involvement through the trade unions National Partnership Group, but that hasn't happened as yet. We did elect Rab Noakes from the Musicians Union to represent the trade unions in the culture sector, but unfortunately that I think the subgroups haven't been set up yet. My involvement has been to read the minutes of the meeting, and my understanding is that its role is as an advisory group at the moment, but I think its its role does need to be clarified, and certainly there needs to be trade union involvement going forward. I think the trade unions working together, and we've worked a lot with Creative Scotland and with Scottish Government, and that's been very helpful for the sector. So I think that needs to happen.
Thank you. And Paul, would you like to respond and maybe also comment on obviously the budget the statement is this afternoon. It seems we're in a position, the last panel talks about the regularly funded organisations and a level of certainty coming from the Creative Scotland around continuing funding, depending on the budget. But that is working within the envelope we've always been within. Do you think there's a need for a continued emergency response for the sector? Because obviously we're back into a really restrictive situation again, and you've talked about redundancies in the sector already. I'd imagine the current situation is creating more pressures within that, as people are maybe thinking about that as options increasingly.
Yes. In terms of the National Partnership for Culture, I have to say I'm a bit of a lost to understand the strategy behind it. As Linda said, the unions asked for engagement and involvement in that body, and we were told by the Cabinet Secretary that it was a group of individual creative artists who were there to advise, and it wasn't a representative body. So the trade unions have been engaging regularly, fortnightly, with civil servants from the Cabinet Secretary's office. I think that we'd be better served by having representative bodies together. In my submission, I'm critical of a number of organisations for not following fair work policies, and I see those organisations represented in the National Partnership for Culture, and our members say, well, how can we possibly expect to see the Cabinet Secretary being given good advice on fair work policies when these are the people that are on it, and I don't see how individual, the great and the good of the industry on an individual basis will help deliver a coherent strategy going forward. So it's unfortunate that a more collaborative approach hasn't been taken in that respect, and it doesn't have a lot of significance, or certainly not positive significance for our members. In terms of the kind of budgetary process, this is something that we have impressed upon the civil servants over the past number of months since March, and I have to say I was delighted our concerns were taken on board with the recent announcement about funding for the three venues in Aberdeen, Inverness and Edinburgh. We started saying to the civil servants in October, if there is not immediate urgent stabilisation funding for these organisations, I will start getting the phone calls in December and early January about more redundancies. So, we were concerned that the initial 10 million, 12.5 million that the Scottish Government announced last year, that came 3 months too late for many of our members, and we made that point in the 3 months preceding the announcement to say that, theatres naturally are very cautious and will always work several months ahead. So, as I said, in December, January, they would be talking to us about redundancies in April. If there is no further fundings announced in the next month or two, those theatres who have received the additional funding, Capital Theatres, Edinburgh, Inverness and other theatres, they will be coming to talk to us probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks about further redundancies from June time, because most of them are now planning on whether or not they will open in September, October. Some are optimistic they might get opened in June, July. But again, one of the MSPs made reference about buying tickets that have been put back till June this year. I'll be surprised if he gets to see the show in June this year, because it was September, October that the touring promoters were deciding, do we continue with our show next summer, or do we put it off until 2022? And at that point, the theatres were saying, people will, because of the circumstances, be quite happy to defer their ticket over until the summer of 21. If we put it back a further year, they'll just want their money back, and that puts us in a desperate situation. But the committee needs to understand that we're always kind of working, in terms of redundancies, we're kind of working 4, 5, 6 months ahead of what people project will be happening. So without further funding, we will be looking at getting the phone calls in the next 4 to 6 weeks for redundancies, further redundancies over the summer. And indeed, the theatres who just received the additional funding in the last few weeks, I understand that announcement came within a week in advance of them phoning me to say, we need to talk about much further redundancies, a lot more redundancies.
Okay, thank you. And Barry, if you can maybe comment on the general discussion we've had so far, but maybe, I suppose, when Paul's talking about delays in performances and theatres now not expecting possibly September to be able to be functioning again. Obviously, the music sector has been significantly hit by the closures. There are some UK music have been pushing for pilots and more trials. Obviously, since December, we're in a more restrictive situation than we expected to be. But are you satisfied with the pace of, or do you think there's enough? It's a difficult time to talk about ambition and things returning, but there are calls for, should we be using the testing system? Should there be more funding for pilots? Do you think there could be more planning about when performances could return and what that might look like?
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I mean, two things really. First of all, just to comment on the general discussion so far, I'll certainly address the questions you're asking about going forward and reopening. But I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that there's so much more that needs to be done at the moment in terms of emergency funding. So, for example, still currently anywhere between 38 and 50% of our members don't qualify for either of the government support schemes, job retention scheme or self-employed income support scheme, because either they're a mix of employed and self-employed, but they don't have the correct percentages in the balance of their work, or they started self-employment in the wrong period after the deadline, or because they operate through their own limited companies. So we've got a whole raft of thousands and thousands and thousands of members who effectively have had no government support since March from central government. Now, one of the encouraging things about Scotland is obviously some of the Cultural Recovery Fund was redirected to be made available for freelancers. Unfortunately, musicians in England didn't get the same type of support, and most of that funding went to organisations and venues, which is great. Those areas need support, but the individual freelancers on the end of it are still suffering massive, massive difficulties. And our impact studies are showing that now around 34% of musicians are considering abandoning their career in music completely. A further 37% aren't sure what's going to happen. So I don't want to lose sight, as we start talking about what may happen going forward, of the fact that there are so many musicians out there at the moment who are effectively stuck, unable to work through no fault of their own, and are not getting any financial support that they need. So I think that's a really important point, and we really need to try and get some parity in the support that's offered to people working in different ways. And this, because I don't envisage a situation where we can flip a switch and members are going to be back to working as they were anytime soon. It's going to be a long road out of this for the months ahead. So my concern is that the longer this goes on, the longer restrictions in place, and the less support that's being given to those individual freelancers and members, then we're going to end up with a situation where more and more people start to drop away from the profession, either becoming utterly reliant on the benefit system or having to go and work in other sectors if they're able to, which will mean a loss that won't be replaced when the industry can reopen again. So that's really important. I think in terms of your question about going forward, I think it is difficult because we're always trying to strike a balance. Obviously, we don't want our members to work in situations that are unsafe. And obviously, you know, we totally agree that people shouldn't be in situations where they're risking transmitting the virus and all the rest of it. But I think there are situations where musicians can perhaps work at different levels at different points. So one of my frustrations with the way the guidance and the performing arts guidance has been administrated is it's tend to take a broad hammer approach to everything and treat every musical performance like it's a gig in a big venue or indoors in front of a huge audience, and that's just not the case. So, for example, things like busking, that's itinerant busking and isn't focused on gathering a crowd, performances of incidental music in hospitality venues, pub beer gardens, or when restaurants are allowed to open again. The idea that we need to restrict somebody sitting in the corner playing a digital piano or a guitar, providing background music, that is subject to the same blanket restriction or ban as a performance indoors in a seated music venue is just not the case. So I agree, yes, there's more that could be done around pilots and thinking about those kind of larger scale performances as we come out of this. But I also think as we gradually begin to ease restrictions, there's more that can be done in terms of a nuanced approach to the performing arts guidance that allows work to happen where it's safe to do so. And we've had situations previously before this kind of third lockdown, where musicians would have been able to work under the general guidance at the time, but the performing arts guidance specifically restricted them from doing so. And blanket bans on musical performance aren't really appropriate because there's so many different types of performance.
That's helpful, thank you, because obviously when we come out of Tier 4, the different tiers have different terms to them. We did have some performances up in Inverness, one of the venues they were able to open on a very small scale, but everything is now closed again. So, but thanks for your contribution.
Thank you very much. I'll now bring in Kenneth Gibson.
Well, thank you very much, Convener. I was expecting to come in at the end as usual, but I am ready nevertheless. And the first person I would like to speak to is Linda Graham. And the question I was going to ask is about universal basic income. I think it's really interesting that 90% of your members support that particular concept. It is, of course, reserved, but I wonder if you can tell us about how you believe that would be able to help your sector at this particular time.
Hi there. Yes, we've run a survey, as you said, which showed that 90% of our members supported UBI, and we believe that it would smooth out the peaks and troughs of artists' income streams. For many years, artists have really struggled with that balance. Sometimes it's like a feast or a famine. You can have maybe too many projects on the go at once, and because work's quite hard to come by, people accept a multitude of different kind of forms of income, and they have to kind of balance their kind of work out, and then suddenly that they can have no income. And obviously COVID is hugely impacted on that scenario. So from the research that we've done, we feel that UBI could be a very good answer to and supplement to steadying out the kind of fluctuations in artists. It's something that we've the artists that we spoke to in our surveys, they're interested in looking at sector-specific pilots around UBI for artists, and there have been trials in the past and similar schemes, but they were keen to point out that they were supportive of this happening across society, and they didn't feel that artists should be given preferential treatment. But certainly for the type of income that our members have, they feel that any form of universal basic income would be a very welcome way of supporting their practice. And I think one interesting thing that we found during the pandemic is artists have been given the opportunity to stop because they've been forced to stop. Some of their income and jobs haven't been able to happen. So it has given them the opportunity to develop their practice. In some cases, not in all cases. Some artists have been able to go back to their studios and use that time for reflection and development. And I think most of our members would say that that is something that they don't have enough time to do. It's something that's really valuable for an artist to have that space and time to develop their work without pressure. And universal basic income would not solve all of the issues around income, obviously, but it would give people, some basis of surviving kind of minimum income thresholds that would support their practice.
Okay, thanks very much. Some geographic pilots are being undertaken, for example, in North Ayrshire, in my own area. But I'm just wondering whether you do feel that this is an issue that should be for the arts sector specifically, or rolled out across to all sectors, and what it should be set at. Because the thing about universal basic income is how much should it be really? So, given that artists are particularly low paid relative to other sectors of the economy, have you got any idea in mind what a universal basic income would start at?
I don't have specific figures to hand, but I know that there have been, various economic assessments of what the costs could be, and some people have set it at £500-600 a month, up to kind of higher rates, depending on the sort of economic assessments that are made. So I don't have a specific figure to hand, and obviously higher levels would be more acceptable than lower levels. But I think that would be something that that economically we would work towards.
Okay, I mean, obviously it's in the gift of Westminster at the moment, but I'm just wondering whether Mr McManus and Mr Dalman also support a UBI, and if they've got any idea about where it could be set at.
Certainly from Victor's perspective, Kenneth, we do support the concept of a UBI, but I think that we would suggest that should be work hand in hand with better implementation of the real living wage. The Scottish Government, every local authority is committed to the real living wage, and the vast majority of our members working in the arts don't get it. Local authorities in Edinburgh, Dundee, Perth will repeatedly issue statements asking the arts organisations to deliver plans on delivering the real living wage, and then due to funding cuts will cut the funding to these organisations. So UBI is determined a desirable ambition. It comes down to funding. We would suggest if the real living wage is deemed to be the poverty line, essentially, then any UBI would need to be based around a calculation on using that as your starting point.
Okay, thanks very much. And Mr Dalman, I'm going to ask you a further question on top of the one that I've just asked. And it's just basically about, we're obviously not there yet because of the COVID situation, but can you talk us through the issues that are creating barriers to musicians in terms of touring overseas at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, broadly speaking, to stay with your first question, UBI is potentially something in the broadest sense that could be useful. Just to give you an idea, 87% of musicians will be earning less than £20,000 this year as a result of what's going on. They generally don't earn much more than that. Certainly they are well below the UK average of 29,600. So I agree with my colleagues that a UBI would help to smooth out some of the variability in the work and provide some stability to allow people to build a career on. My only concern is that if that were implemented, we would need to try and ensure that there isn't a knock-on effect where then fees could be squeezed and individual payments would come down. At the heart of the MU, we've always campaigned for fair rates of pay and very much support the fair work emphasis at the moment in Scotland. So yes, broadly speaking, in principle, but obviously the devil would be in the details of that. But it's definitely something that I would like to see us explore. Yes, talking about the Europe issue, I mean, it's a double whammy at the moment for the music industry, particularly the live sector, which has been absolutely destroyed by COVID. And on top of all the problems that the pandemic has caused, we're now faced with the implications of Brexit, which means that touring in the EU is going to be significantly more expensive and more complicated administratively, in a way that will probably preclude a lot of the lower level work that happens from being able to take place as we emerge from this. And it's not the top end of the industry that will be affected by the new requirements for potentially visas, work permits, carnets, etc. The arena tours for international artists will figure out a way around that and probably stick a few extra pounds on a ticket price to offset the cost. For musicians in the UK, Europe is effectively the domestic market for live work because the UK geographically is just not big enough to sustain a career touring up and down the country. So Europe has really always been our domestic touring pool. Now we've got huge changes in the way that we're going to be able to access the EU countries. And just to give you an example, we were looking at the costs of carnets potentially for moving equipment into another country when you're on tour. We're probably looking at anywhere from £250 to £400 as an initial fee for a carnet, plus a security deposit of up to 20% potentially of the value of the equipment that you're taking with you, which won't be refunded for a year. So just to give you a very recent example, talking to a member recently about the possibility of being booked for a wedding in France. Now, previously, that would have been logistically easy to organise before coronavirus, just to make your travel arrangements, go over there, do your work, get paid, come home again. Now we're looking at a cost potentially of far more than the economic value of the gig, just making it not viable. And that's just one example of the low-level engagements that are just not going to be feasible anymore for UK musicians. And the knock-on effect is just going to be huge.
Okay, thanks very much. And Mr. McManus, I want to go back to yourself to talk about growth sectors, because I found very interesting Big Two's submission about how when we had the financial crisis just over a decade ago, that as we bounced out of it, the growth in the kind of arts sector was significantly higher than the economy as a whole. And clearly the argument there is that additional support for the sector would actually be very sensible in terms of helping to boost the Scottish and UK economy. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that a wee bit. And obviously you did mention living wage previously, but of course Alone Scotland, we're supportive of that. Again, it's reserved and we can't enforce
it. I appreciate that, Bill. Currently it's a reserved matter. It was a point that research that Big Two conducted several months ago showed that after the banking crisis, it was the creative industries who outperformed every other industry in leading the recovery. On a general level, we're deeply concerned that because cultural industries will be the last ones to open up again after the pandemic, or as restrictions ease, if we ever go over the pandemic, then the cultural industries won't be in a position to lead that recovery, and that will, in a very broad sense, it will potentially keep us in recession for that much longer, and the whole economy will take much longer to recover because of that. And that's why it's essential to us that the live event sector, the theatre, the arts sector are given the additional funding that the Ernst Young report talks about, to kind of give it a boost to start up again. I mean, we have seen some encouraging signs. In Australia currently, theatres are operating at 70% capacity, and by March, April, they're hoping to be closer to 100% capacity. So hopefully there's some cautious signs of optimism there that there will be a willingness from people to re-engage with the arts very quickly. But that's on the basis that we have an arts sector and a live event sector in particular that is given the additional funding necessarily to get it reopened quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we obviously spent most of this morning talking about pounds, shillings and pence, but I think there's a real morale issue for the general population. I mean, I think we really need live performances, as a society and as human beings, simply to feel more alive. So I think it's not just about that. And I think in arguments being made about supporting the sector financially, I think we perhaps undersell the impact that the sector has on a general morale, particularly given the the number of people who've been feeling very low because of the pandemic. So, is there any kind of figures that you have in terms of, you know, bang for buck, so to speak? So, for example, the Scottish Government's having its statement today and will deliberate over this over the next few weeks over the budget. So, for example, compared to any other sector, what would £1 deliver to the Scottish economy as opposed to £1 spent on average, shall we say, in other parts of the Scottish economy? So that we can make arguments to say that, well, you know, if you put X amount, £1 million additional money into the sector, this is what you'll get in terms of effective growth and jobs, as well as the morale issue I've just mentioned.
Currently, our understanding across the UK is that for every £1 you spend in the arts, that you'll generate in excess of £20 into the economy. You know, and in the submission I talk about, you know, the 5 big regional theatres. Every £1 you give, that is going towards local employment. It's going towards supporting local artists, local musicians. It's bringing people into the local economy to spend money. I don't, to be honest, have any comparisons with other industries. But you know, I think overall across the UK, the cultural sector is ranked number 3 in terms of economic benefit and the size of the industry, looking across everything: digital, music, live events, theatre. So, you know, I think its kind of track record speaks for itself. I don't know some more definitive figures to hand to give you.
No, but it was an interesting submission. I mean, I think the figures you gave did that were actually very helpful. So thank you very much for that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good afternoon. No, good morning still to the panel. Sorry, and hopefully you can hear me better than the last panel. But I just wanted to raise a couple of issues or ask a couple of questions. And I think the first one, probably, if I can direct it to Barry, it was around, you know, issues in, say, the tourism sector and the hospitality sector. The real concerns responding to, you know, quite quick turnarounds on decisions, introduction of restrictions and the like. And obviously that's going to happen with a pandemic. But it was really just to get a bit of an idea of how important a kind of clarity going forward in terms of being able to you know, have knowledge of what events are happening, things like particularly some of the regional events like jazz festivals, blues festivals, folk festivals, etc., might be to your members, and for them to be able to plan in, given all the other issues that there are out there at the moment. And if I can direct that to Barry first, please.
Thank you. Yes, you've hit the nail on the head that clarity of how and when things will happen going forward is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to emerge from this situation with an intact industry, frankly. Certainly in terms of hospitality, it's the kind of heart of the grassroots music sector, pubs, restaurants, small venues. These are the kind of beginnings, the grassroots of the music industry. And if our members aren't able to work in those venues, then it kind of has an upward effect where there's a huge knock on. And actually as well, that kind of grassroots work for members supplements some of their other work as well, which may not be sustainable if they don't have that income. So it's not uncommon to find somebody on quite a high profile tour one week and then coming back and playing in a local venue with a different band the next week. That's how musicians work. Their careers portfolio, not only in terms of the variety of activities that they undertake, but also the levels that they work at. They jump up and down. So it's absolutely essential that there's clarity about what will happen going forward. Certainly in terms of festivals, they are just totally in the dark at the moment as to whether they'll be able to operate this year. Quite a lot of them managed to get through last year by either moving dates back or being able to refund before too many financial commitments were made. But the uncertainty around when things will be able to happen just makes it impossible to plan at the moment. There are also real difficulties in things like in terms of are they going to be insurable? Is it going to be possible to insure your festival against further COVID restrictions? And it seems unlikely at the moment. So I think we're probably going to need some government intervention on that, or some assistance. But one of the key things for us at all levels is, as we emerge from this, it's really important to remember that we're not going to be able to flick a switch and go back to how we were. So musicians, orchestras, touring bands, pretty much every level of the industry needs to be planning about 18 months, 2 years ahead at any given time. We just can't do that at the moment. I think what we could start doing now, although it might not be clear at what point we will start to emerge from this and at what point restrictions can be lifted, what we can start doing is putting in a framework to say, okay, at this point, this is what could happen in terms of the industry then. So somebody mentioned before the idea of having performances, but where you couldn't have a full audience in attendance, you could have a restricted audience. So some kind of support scheme for that, where there may be some subsidies to help live performances resume when they're not able to fill the venue and sell the number of tickets that they would normally through no fault of their own, sort of seat out to help out, if you will. Those kind of things, and being able to say to festivals, yes, we will be able to insure your festival. Being able to say to artists, yes, at this point you will be able to start planning again. We might not be able to say that whether that's March or April, May, June or whatever, but we can start to think about the stages as we emerge from this and start to put some plans into place to try and give people the ability to look forward a little bit.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, I think insurance is one of those things that probably the public don't think about. You know, that need to insure events and the kind of additional costs. Can I then kind of move on, because obviously that then requires planning. It requires discussions, consultations with the government and some of the government agencies. Are you kind of happy with how that's happening? And do you feel that you're having the opportunity to talk to government about that, to liaise with them, and they understand that? And also their agencies like Visit Scotland and Events Scotland are on board on what your needs will be to provide the clarity and then to provide the promotion kind of looking forward.
I mean, I don't think we can ever talk as much as we'd like to government. I mean, I think probably the situation in Scotland for us as a region, I feel we probably have a little bit more access here than perhaps we do in Westminster. We have a better dialogue and a bit more of a direct relationship. So that's useful. I think the frustration is kind of, as Bill Armstrong alluded to in the first panel, that really there's just a lack of understanding about the exact nature of what working in these industries looks like and the things that are required to sustain and help the industry. And sometimes it very much feels like decisions are taken without consultation or without proper discussion with people like the unions, who frankly are best placed to advise on what type of support might be most beneficial. And so we do feel like we're a little bit in the dark a lot of the time, and we would much prefer to be in part of an ongoing discussion about when ideas are conceived, rather than having to deal with something that's dictated as a decision that we weren't involved in.
I think you may join a number of sectors in exactly that position, but thanks very much for that. Linda, I don't know, Linda Graham, I don't know if you want to come in with any thoughts on that as well.
Yes, I do feel that we could be more involved in setting some agendas, and I think if anything's positive has come out of the pandemic, it is that perhaps there's a little bit more understanding of the precarious nature of artists' working lives. I think what we need to do next is absolutely ensure that we do something about that, and not have artists at the end of the line when it comes to when funding is dispersed, and artists feel that there's no parity there. They're quite often forgotten. And that's why they have started to open up their eyes to think and listen to ideas like universal basic income. Just to go back to our earlier question that was there about the rate of that, I've just looked up some information. And in Ireland, the Cultural Recovery Task Force is recommending €352 a week for a pilot scheme for the creative sector to try and alleviate some of the difficulties. But I do think, yeah, there needs to be more engagement with artists, more understanding about their working life. I think quite often artists are reluctant to talk about how they do struggle. We quite often see artists that are very well known, that have maybe won prizes like the Turner Prize, and yet their income levels, if you were to find out, and we do know because people sent us their bank statements at the beginning of COVID, so we got a kind of very raw feedback about people's experiences. And if you're regarded as a successful artist, and you're very well qualified, you quite often got a master's, a PhD, and yet you're earning around about 10k a year from your practice, it's very dispiriting and quite hard for people to talk about. So absolutely, we want to be more. The unions want to be more involved, and with all of the sector bodies, we have welcomed greater involvement through regular meetings with the Scottish Government, and I think that has made a huge difference. But it absolutely, as Barry said, more needs to happen.
Thanks, Liz. I mean, I represent obviously the Highlands and Islands. I'm from Orkney, so I think we value, particularly up in the Northern Isles, the cultural, artistic community that we have. It's so vital, as in itself, but also as part of our tourism operation, and also just a society. I think Barry wanted to come in as well on that.
Yeah, just a point about kind of broader things as well in terms of the discussion around UBI. I mean, one of the things that dramatically affects our members' income at the moment is the issue around streaming of music. And I was reminded when Linda was talking about quite high-profile artists who aren't able to sustain themselves, really. And you might be aware, I'm sure you will be aware, of the DCMS inquiry going on into music streaming at the moment, which was largely as a result of the campaigning we've been doing on the issue. When you have really high-profile artists, people like Nadine Shah, who've won awards and are always in the media, and yet they're struggling to pay their bills as a result of the disparity in the industry. These are things that are really regulatory and legislative that can be done without actually financial investment from government. So I think in terms of music streaming, for example, the relationship between the labels and the streaming platforms and the artists is completely out of whack. So a label will typically be receiving 55p out of every pound that comes from streaming. Of that 55p, the artists are only getting around 10 to 20%, assuming that they have already earned enough to recoup their advances. But until so there are plenty of people earning nothing from Spotify as a result. And if it was subject to the same type of broadcast regulation as, say, radio, then they would be receiving at least performance royalties from the moment the track went live. So there are things that can be done, and that's a great example that doesn't always involve direct funding from the government. And I think what we do need is a broader discussion about the way the whole creative sector operates, and rather than just seeing it as a problem that can only be solved by throwing money at it, yes, investment is hugely important, and I'm a firm advocate that we need more investment to help our industries, but also looking at the way that the industries are structured and the way people work in the industries and where the money goes, that type of stuff can be done without huge financial investment. There just needs to be the political willingness to make it happen.
That's really interesting. My cousin is actually a musician in Brighton, and his gigs that he does are in the pubs, which obviously have been closed. And I was actually quite surprised at how well he does from streaming. But he may well be an exception, or it may just be particular times. So it's really interesting what you say, that there is that there. It's not just about government funding or public funding. It is about how the industry is supported through all parts of it, and sectors as well. So thank you very much and for that, and to the panel and convener. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. And now Stuart Stevenson, MSP.
Thank you very much, convener. And if I may just go back to Barry for my first questions. And Barry was talking about the streaming of music, as indeed was Jamie in response. And I raised with the previous panel the issue of copyright. And I just wonder to what extent that is an issue for musicians. Because, of course, I'm pretty clear there's a lot of copyright material that I can access in a couple of clicks, which will deliver absolutely nothing to anybody in the production stream of this. And we were told that attempts to update the copyright had not been progressed. Is that an issue, Barry?
Yes, frankly, is the simple answer. We were very keen that the European Copyright Directive was adopted in the original form. It wasn't, unfortunately. It was watered down in the end. But I think that there's a key. Yes, the streaming platform issue is a massive one, and just to comment on your predecessor's friend who does quite well out of streaming. That's possible if you're the master rights owner for your own recordings, if you're an independent artist, because you're getting that 55p that comes back to the master rights owner. But if you're signed to a label, then the label's taking the lion's share of it. But at least with those platforms, there is money directly coming back from the platform to the rights owners, and there are licenses in place to allow them to use that music. For me, one of the biggest issues is the larger platforms. YouTube's the obvious example, where the sheer volume of music on YouTube is enormous, and yet the amount of revenue that artists see from that when their music is used is fractional. You know, there's not proper agreements in place. There's not proper willingness for the platforms to, frankly, to pay what they should be paying for the music that they're using, and instead they hide behind the argument that we just provide the platform and we're not responsible for the content that's on there. But the reality is that the audience of those platforms exists because of the content that's available. And when the content is copyright material, then and that platform is able to monetize that through advertising revenue, then they should be paying proper license fees, and they should be subject to the same licensing rules that apply to the local restaurants, the hairdressers, the venues, the pubs, football arenas, everywhere that uses recorded music. They should be paying their fair share, and they're not at the moment. And it's a huge potential source of revenue for our members and those working in the sector that's just not available, and it's not fair.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I thought you might say, but we've now got it on the record, and that's itself. And I do know that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson has just said that his friend or relative, I've just temporarily forgotten which, is the master owner, and hence that's one of the reasons he's doing well. I hope I'm not misquoting Jamie in saying that. But I wonder, in the digital world, the broadcast world, we have broadcasters that are designated as public service broadcasters who work on a set of rules that at least are visible and owned by government and therefore can be enforced. Is it time for that sort of rule base to be more broadly extended to cover other platforms, including platforms that are digital only rather than broadcast?
Yes, almost certainly is the answer. I mean, the problem that we've got in the music industry is that the delivery of digital material and the way that that's changed over a period, we haven't really adapted both the regulatory frameworks and the way the finances work to reflect the new industry. So we're still very much based on the old model of radio, TV, and selling physical product. Whereas as we've moved to a digital economy, we almost got there in terms of digital downloads. We started to treat those like CDs sales and physical media sales. But very quickly that evolved into streaming. And streaming is just not subject to the same practices, rules, and regulations as other sectors where music is used. So yes, we do need to massively tighten up on those things, and there's no reason why the digital economy and digital delivery systems shouldn't be subject to the same agreements, rules, regulations as, frankly, other types of music users are. So it's an issue going forward, and it's an issue we have to struggle with on a daily basis as a union as well when we're negotiating with orchestras, for example. When we're talking about media rights, at one time that meant physical recordings of the orchestra's performances, but they were in our collective agreements, and we're having to adapt those as we go forward to deal with the increasing world of digital streaming. And so should musicians be paid the same fee for a live stream of their concert performance as they should for recording a CD for sale? Probably not. So it requires a new approach and a new adjustment. So it is an evolving area, but again, it comes back to what I was talking before about political will and the desire to get a hold of this properly and get some parity and fairness across all levels of music usage and not just the old school models.
Of course, the radio model was, and this is before you were born, I'm quite clear about this, was affected by the many radio stations that were at least 3 miles from the UK's coast in the 1960s. Although, interestingly, a couple of the pirate stations actually did pay for broadcasting music, but almost all of them didn't. The government ultimately just shut them down, essentially. But that was because one of them started broadcasting political matters, not because they cared about musicians. Anyway, may I move to Linda next? Just say to Linda, incidentally, I was delighted to hear the mention of Rab Noakes, because I was at school with Rab a very long time ago. We are of similar ages, Rab and I, obviously. Linda, again, how in relation to your members is the digital world affecting you, and what can government do? And I think, you know, what I've just heard from Barry is things that we could do. They don't actually mean large cheques have to be written, and therefore you would think governments might be quite inclined to help out. Are there things in your area that could be similarly done by government action to supplement the writing of cheques at the moment?
Hi there, thanks for that question. Yes, I think a lot of artists have pivoted their work or adapted it so that they can use digital platforms to promote themselves and to sell work online. I do know that there is quite a low rate of return. If you're selling work online, it takes a lot of input. You have to have your work photographed well. Obviously, you have to have a platform to sell it on. Sometimes people don't have the access to the hardware or the expertise, you know, amongst, you know, everything else that's going on in COVID. It's been quite a challenge for people. And so some of that is about money to support people for training. But I think there's some very interesting ideas that have come out of it, you know, artists having virtual visits to their studios whilst people are not able to visit in person. One of our speakers earlier talked about the engagement with the communities. There are a lot of artists supporting adults with additional support needs to do very interesting projects, you know, within the restrictions that are there. As maybe Lucy had said quite a lot before this, digital is no replacement, and I think there's a little bit of digital fatigue perhaps coming into the picture. You know, artists are saying to us they want, you know, there's the importance of that connection and explaining your work in front of somebody at a preview, you know, experiencing the work. Art is obviously a very sensory process, and digital just really doesn't replace that. But I wouldn't want to lose some of the positive aspects of the kind of digital world that have emerged. Certainly as a union, our learning programme has very much engaged with a lot more members digitally over this period. So we would probably, going forward, want to have certainly more support for artists to be able to use digital during this period as we sort of hopefully come out of the restrictions. But there definitely needs to be more investment. But there are creative ways of using digital.
I sort of picked up from your response there, Linda, that there's a skills gap as well. Would it be helpful, therefore, if colleges or other education providers were to step up to the mark to help those artists who need that lifting of certain skills area? Would that be something that would be worth thinking about?
Yes, I certainly think it's something that the art schools could do. We've got a graduate membership in our union, which is fairly new. So we've been hearing some stories about their experience of having to have their degree shows online last year. And I'm not sure if any of you had a chance to sort of look at those different sort of formats that the work was presented in. Some was more successful than others. There was a couple of art colleges I looked at, and I just thought, I am not enjoying this experience at all, seeing the graduates' work. So, and a lot of graduates were very unhappy about not being able to show their work in a physical space, particularly if your work's, sculptural, installational. It doesn't lend itself well, particularly. So I think there's certainly a role for art colleges and universities to sort of focus on that. And obviously when people graduate, to support them with moving from, what is a difficult process anyway. When you finish your degree, you move out into the real world. There's definitely not enough support there for graduates to make that transition to how they make a living. We try and support them in the union, but absolutely there needs to be more funding for that process.
Right, let me just move finally to Paul, and I've got my eye on the clock, convener. And Paul, in your previous contributions, you mentioned digital, and I'm kind of focusing on digital. And I just wanted a kind of bit of a broad brush and perhaps one or two examples of how the digital world is affecting your members in the industries that the union is engaged with.
Yes, thanks. I think if I start with the broadcasting areas, a number of people have kind of touched on broadcasting. I mean, copyright issues by and large aren't a huge issue for our members. Where they come up in, producers, directors, we tend to find is perhaps issues around some of the bigger broadcasters that are the problem there. The biggest issue that we've had in recent years in the digital sector, the broadcast sector in recent years, has been the introduction of the new BBC Scotland channel, which was instigated with unrealistically low commissioning tariffs. So, your copyright and residual fees don't mean a lot if you get very little money in the first instance for the piece of work you've provided. And BBC Scotland's commissioning tariffs for the new BBC Scotland channel have met with universal condemnation across the industry. We regularly get complaints from production companies, from producers, from artists, saying that they're just completely unrealistic and they're driving the industry into a race to the bottom in Scotland. The other aspects of digital and online, which I include with that, is a number of the film productions that would have gone to cinematic release are now going straight out to online or digital sales. That said, the industry is much more buoyant at the minute. So that's been a positive, although we are seeing a lot of people moving across from the arts and theatres into the film and TV and the online sector, which is creating further problems for the live, the live arts side of it. I think the biggest benefit, which Linda has touched on from a digital point of view, has been the skills and training programme that we've been delivering online. That has been there's been a huge demand for that while people have been out of work or looking to retrain or get back into it. And it's been important to us to understand that it's less about the money is important, but it's more the strategy. And I think our engagement with the Creative Scotland, Scottish Government civil servants and Screen Scotland has been hugely helpful over the past 12 months. And it's more about getting people to understand the strategy. You've got certainly within the sort of screen sectors, the online and digital sectors, you've got Screen Skills, you've got Skills Development Scotland, you've got Scottish Enterprise, you've got Scottish universities and colleges, you've got the employers and broadcasters, you've got Screen Scotland, and there is a sort of uniquely lack of clarity and strategy about the whole process. Creative Scotland and Screen Scotland in particular, in terms of digital and online, they're now developing strategies which are very welcome. Bectu has run a training initiative, skills development initiative over the past 12 years, Bectu Vision, which has been supported by both Scottish Union Learning and Screen Scotland and the BBC and others. And it's very much driven on giving people the skills they need to get jobs. Particularly in the areas of, producers. If we can get Scottish-based producers to a level that commissioners are happy with, then they will hire Scottish-based crews. That has been tremendously successful over the years, and as I say, it's now that Screen Scotland is sort of putting its skills strategy in place, hopefully a lot of the contradictions and the confusion can begin to be cleared up. And I think from the point of view, that side will be hugely important. It allows us, and I'm sure everybody's seen it in terms of using Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams over the past 12 months, particularly in terms of delivering training, skills, knowledge, and inclusion to the communities in the more rural areas. It's been a huge advantage to us. If we try and deliver a first aid course in Glasgow, which would be the traditional way to do it, or one of our, finance for freelancers courses, you invite 20 people into a training room in Glasgow, and people in the Highlands Islands, the borders would say, I can't afford the time and the money to get there. Now, over the past 12 months, we've all learned how to do that online, and that has been a huge boost. That is giving a lot of our members in the more rural areas the skills and the confidence they need to now find work in the industry or to progress within the industry.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very interesting. And back to you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. We're just coming to the end of the time there. I just wanted to go back to the Musicians' Union and about this streaming issue, because I raised it when I was speaking in the debate that was led by Claire Baker, actually, on live music venues, and the number of musicians who get such a pittance from streaming services. Now, my understanding is that to regulate big tech in this way would have to be done at a UK level. Is that correct? And what are the barriers? Given that these are global industries, what are the barriers to regulating big tech in that way? Or do you think there aren't any barriers?
I think much of it comes down to a will. I'm not sure. I'd have to come back to you on the question of whether it's something that could be done in Scotland directly, or whether it would require UK government to implement it. But it's clear that it can be done. For example, in Spain at the moment, they now have a different approach to streaming completely. So the Spanish government's introduced legislation that requires certain money to be distributed in different ways through streaming platforms. So it's something that can be done. It just requires, first of all, the will to do it, but secondly, the understanding of how it actually works. So most people don't understand how streaming income works and how streaming revenues. Most musicians don't understand it. So trying to get politicians and the broader public, who obviously would have to support legislation, is difficult. It's a big challenge because it's a complicated issue. But the basic principles for me have got to come back to the issue of, if music is being used on a streaming platform, then it should be subject to the same fees, royalties, and regulations as comparable platforms. Now, something like Spotify, for example, as probably the most common platform, where that's recommending songs to you and that's picking tunes, it's not so much that you are selecting those tunes. It's really acting more like a radio station. in a lot of respects, where it's kind of just broadcasting music rather than making it available, which is the term that they use. So it should be regulated in the same way as radio. So for one obvious glaring example is if you have played as a session musician on a record and that record gets played on a radio station, you will be entitled to performance royalties from that. There are no performance royalties coming to people in that position from streaming platforms whatsoever, because the labels and stuff just buy completely. Yeah, exactly. So that goes to the label holder.
Yeah, also, sorry to interrupt, PRS have actually been supplying grants, have been offering grants to musicians affected by the lockdown, haven't they? And I've seen a number of these opportunities for different musicians to apply for hardship grants or creative grants, and yet the streaming platforms aren't paying into PRS at all.
I'll just correct you there in that about 15% of streaming revenue comes back to the publishing rights holder. So either to the publishers or the songwriters directly, depending on whether they're signed to a publisher or not. Those revenues will be distributed through PRS. So they do get some money from streaming. Whether it's sufficient, whether a sort of 55% go into the master rights holder, which is the copyright in the audio recording, and only 15% go into the copyright in the song, the publishing rights, whether that's a fair split is questionable. There is some revenue comes back through PRS, and it's true that the PRS do, through the PRS Foundation, offer funding opportunities for musicians, not just as a result of the pandemic, but they have done for some time now, often through uncollected royalty or royalties that they've collected, but they don't have the details to distribute to because the people aren't members, those kind of things. But yes, I agree in terms of the copyright holders, both in terms of the musicians performing in their artistic performances and the songwriters. Basically, the whole thing is just skewed too much in favour of the master rights holders, and too often that means the big labels. And of course, those percentages at one time may have been justified where labels were having to invest massively in recordings and they were dealing with physical distribution, product manufacture, warehousing, transportation, and all of those costs. But digital products cost a fraction to create as the others, but the contracts that musicians are working under are still based on that old model, and it really needs addressing. I mean, the other thing that a lot of people would be quite happy to see is music users would accept a small price increase for their monthly subscription to a streaming service if they knew that money was going to the musicians. So even without changing anything, you could put £1 on the monthly subscription on the proviso that would go straight back to the performers on the recordings. It's relatively easy stuff to do. It's just that it requires a collective will to do so. And of course, the people who have got too big of a pie at the moment and are quite happy with the way things set up are not going to change. So that change is going to have to be imposed on them, which is where we need legislation.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Thanks very much, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about. Can I thank all our contributors to the second panel today, Mr. Graham, Mr. McManus and Mr. Dalman, for attending and giving their evidence. It was very helpful to our deliberations, and that includes the public part of this morning's meeting. I will allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break and then move to Microsoft Teams before we resume in private session. Thanks again. Goodbye.